Chapter 257. You have never seen that creature before. It is about 2 meters tall when it stands upright and covered in hair. It is said that it has some kind of blood relationship with the goblins on the surface. But compared with their weak but numerous distant relatives, this branch can be said to be an anomaly. They are strong, and even a newborn baby among the bear goblins is comparable to a human adult. Brando said slowly. If the bear goblins raise their shields and flail as cover, it will be quite troublesome for the troglodytes to dig underground. He paused and changed the topic. But most of the troglodytes live in symbiosis with the bear goblins. Who knows if there are bear goblins in the lumber mill? Everyone was startled and looked back at the lumber mill on the other side of the river. The wooden gate creaked as it rose again. A group of subterranean dwellers walked out from the gate. Then, a series of heavy footsteps were heard. Behind them were 3 clumsy creatures. The gigantic creatures held a large shield in one hand and dragged a flail with a rattling chain in the other as they slowly walked out from behind the gate. Bear goblins. Although most of the people present had never seen such creatures before, they recognized these new monsters according to Brando's description. They were more than 2 meters tall, covered in long brown hair, and their heads seemed to be curled up on their broad shoulders. They held a shield in one hand and a flail in the other. It was almost the same as the young man's description. Everyone couldn't help but look at the young lord with admiration. Yuta was a little silent. She looked at the young lord meaningfully as if she was trying to find something different about him. I have seen this thing before. Rabin stared at the group of monsters that were crossing the river and suddenly said, we once dealt with it in Karsuk. More than a dozen soldiers couldn't get close to it. His tanned face changed color for the first time. My lord, are you sure this thing is also a first-class organization? Brando nodded. The ranks of the army were first set up by the 4 great temples, and they were not only based on individual fighting strength. The bugbear's brains aren't too good. Due to their symbiotic relationship with the subterranean dwellers, they haven't been able to form a sizable army. If not for the fact that the subterranean dwellers are the foundation of the foundation in Jorgundi's army, and the bugbears that have been fighting side by side with them have formed a set of fixed tactics, I'm afraid these idiots wouldn't have been classified as a first-class unit. Vern nodded and kept silent. At this moment, the subterranean dwellers and the 3 bugbears were wading through the middle of the river bank. Although the subterranean dwellers at the edge of the forest had retreated far away, they still surrounded Meferi's group of 4. The riverbank was strangely quiet for a moment. The invisible scales were swaying on the battlefield. The subterranean dwellers launched a second round of attacks, but they immediately felt that something was wrong. At this time, the 2 crossbowmen on the stone bunker threw away the heavy crossbows in their hands and unsheathed the long swords from their backs. They were 2 long swords with 2 rows of strange patterns on the blades, which shone under the sun. Magic swords. One of the mercenaries shouted in a low voice. The magic sword here did not refer to the low-level alchemy goods that most people could get their hands on. It was a magic sword that was worthy of its name. At the very least, it was a magic item that was at the level of bronze or above. It was a creation that could change the strength of the wielder to a certain extent. Whose men are those? All the mercenary leaders' gazes were focused on Yuta, Vern, and Cornelius. In their opinion, only these 3 leaders could bring out such a luxurious lineup. However, the 3 leaders were also puzzled. Although they had the same thought, those were not their men. But if one were to say that they were only surprised at first, then in the next moment, they all held their breaths. 2 snow-white sword lights flashed on the stone bunker, and the 2 subterranean dwellers who had leaped onto the wall were cleanly cut into 2. This was already the strength of a peak iron rank, close to silver rank. Among the many mercenaries present, only the 3 great leaders had this standard. Who is that? Yuta finally turned to Cornelius and asked, Cornelius, are they your men? It was a pity that Cornelius was not in the mood to answer her question. When he saw the 2 swords, his expression finally changed. He turned to look at Brando and recognized them. They were the holy swords used by the two angels who followed Brando that night. He finally understood why Vern was willing to send his most capable wizard as bait. With two silver-ranked warriors as his bodyguards, what was there to be worried about? However, the middle-aged mercenary leader's knowledge could not represent the others. Not everyone present could recognize the two swords, and for a moment, only the sound of gasps could be heard in the forest. Brando did not reply, but under his gaze, the subterranean dwellers who had their attacks thwarted retreated to the sides. The first bugbear that came ashore suddenly rushed forward with large strides. They swung the flails in their hands and hammered the magic castles in the air. There was a loud bang. It was the sound of earth and stone cracking. The earthen and stone castle immediately fell apart. Everyone saw the two crossbowmen who were pretending to be weak suddenly jump up high. One of them grabbed the wizard while the other grabbed the warrior. They then rolled backwards and landed on the ground. The subterranean dwellers let out an excited shriek as they prepared to attack. However, at that moment, with a sharp whistle, a group of more than 50 cavalrymen suddenly appeared from the forest. Everyone subconsciously turned to look. Vern and Yuta saw that the leader of the group was the Nightsong Tiger. It was the mercenaries of Lopez and a few other unknown mercenary groups. "My lord, what are you doing?" Vern suddenly realized that Brando was trying to lure the main force of the subterranean dwellers over. If he sent too many troops at the start, it would alert the enemy. However, if he slowly increased the number of troops, it would be like boiling a frog in warm water. This is the Nightsong Tiger's idea. Brando stared at the riverbank, his eyes glowing. The key is that the subterranean dwellers are not willing to give up on the bugbears and their companions. This is a weakness of the underworld residents. The young man smiled. In fact, it's not just the NPCs, even the players would occasionally make this mistake. After all, the population of Georgandy Ridge is too precious. In fact, when the Nightsong Tiger mentioned this idea to him, he knew that it would succeed. It was too ingenious. It was no different from the way the players used to manipulate the underworld residents. When he saw the two pristine angels and their companions crawling up from the ground, they cheered as if they had suddenly seen reinforcements. He couldn't help but feel a little amused. He thought that he was a little too wretched. "NPC. Player?" Vern asked. Brando coughed and replied, "Look in front." The three commanders turned their heads at the same time. The lumber mill's gate creaked as it was pulled open again. But this time, it wasn't just one gate. There were 3 gates in the north, south, east, and west. Everyone could see an endless stream of subterranean dwellers pouring out from behind the tall wooden fence as if there was no end to them. Cornelius gasped when he counted the number of subterranean dwellers. There were more than 200 of them. It seemed that his estimation was off by quite a bit. This meant that there were more than 300 subterranean dwellers in the camp. With Martha at the top, how were they supposed to fight? It was one thing to lure them out, but it seemed that even if the enemy gave up on the terrain advantage, they still wouldn't be able to take them down. He looked at Brando with a pale face. Brando watched silently as the subterranean dwellers waded across the river. Their goal was to save their own troops before the cavalry could regroup with their companions. In terms of speed, they did have the advantage. But Brando was waiting for this moment. He didn't care about the ugly expressions of the 3 commanders and raised his hand, "Load the crossbows." Everyone was stunned. Looking at the black mass of subterranean dwellers and the earth spirit bugbears behind them, they lacked the courage to continue fighting. Even at this time, half of the enemy was still on the riverbank. Wasn't it too early to load the crossbows? But no one dared to disobey a lord's orders. Regardless of whether the lord lived up to his name, Brando's noble status and strength were enough to make the 3 commanders agree with him. Since the three largest mercenary groups didn't have any objections, the others naturally didn't dare to voice their opinions. Moreover, the bait was still at the edge of the forest, and they couldn't just leave their companions alone. The mercenaries unstrapped the crossbows on their backs and pulled the handles back to load the crossbows. Since their opponents were the subterranean dwellers, they had no choice but to slow down and tighten the bowstrings bit by bit. One by one, the crossbows were raised, and a rustling sound could be heard in the forest, as if a breeze was blowing through the treetops. Level the crossbows. Brando lowered his voice and ordered the last person to load the crossbow. The timing was just right. The Earth Spirit Bears and the subterranean dwellers were waiting across the river. Because they had slowed down, Brendel's accurate prediction surprised all the commanders. Cornelius even turned around and looked at Brando in surprise. He was the sharpest among the three commanders, but he didn't expect Brando to have such an understanding of his mercenaries. After all, they had never given the command of their mercenaries to this young man. How on earth did he guess that? However, Brando was secretly laughing in his heart. In Erewhon, the strength of the mercenaries were almost the same, and their habit of loading their crossbows was also the same. The scene just now was just a confirmation of his experience in the game, and it wasn't the first time he made such a prediction. Not to mention the Earth Spirit Bugbears and subterranean dwellers, even the faster Wind Elf cavalry would be able to get these mercenaries to strike first. At this moment, every mercenary, including the Magi, laid down the heavy crossbow in their hands, or at the very least, a handheld crossbow. Every mercenary was equipped with a long-range weapon. Even if they didn't have a crossbow, they would at least prepare a bow or a musket. Every crossbow was aimed at their respective targets, but the tide of enemies made them wonder how effective this round of attacks would be. Everyone couldn't help but think. Did the young lord say that this was just a warm-up? The question was there really such a warm-up? Brando didn't answer. He waited for 2 seconds and snapped his fingers. Fire. Author's note: it wasn't easy for me to overcome this obstacle. Everyone, please give me some support. It's really painful to live with a writer's block. I don't have the energy to do anything. Chapter 258. A buzzing sound came from the forest beside the riverbank. Countless thorns suddenly sprouted out from the green bushes and formed a translucent black wall that swept across the cobblestone riverbank. The subterranean dwellers who were standing at the front were caught off guard and were hit by the wall. It was as if they had really hit an invisible wall, and the huge impact caused them to stagger and retreat. The corpses that were pierced with arrows lay motionless in the middle of the riverbank. The subterranean dwellers were stunned by the sudden rain of arrows. The ones in front were forced to retreat, but the ones behind were still pushed forward by the huge inertia. Hundreds of subterranean dwellers collided with each other on the riverbank, and it was a complete mess. This is our chance. The same thought flashed through the minds of Janna and Fern, who were hiding in the bushes. They immediately unsheathed their rapiers and greatswords. It seemed that they were ready to seize this opportunity to lead their men in a charge and defeat these subterranean dwellers. However, Brando also unsheathed his long sword from the scabbard at his waist. With a wave of his right hand, a gust of wind blew past the two mercenary leaders. Along with the gust of wind, dead trees and chopped leaves flew up and fell to the ground. Yuta and Rabin held their breath and stopped to look at the young lord. "My lord?" Rabin asked. "Attack formation. Get into formation on the riverbank." Brando looked ahead. In his vision, the Nightsong Tiger and his mercenaries were circling the riverbank and preparing to charge forward. "My lord, but..." The red-haired mercenary leader glared at the subterranean dwellers who were in a mess. She gritted her teeth and said, "This is our chance. Your opponents are not humans." Brando glanced at her and replied concisely. He raised his left hand and pointed at his ear, indicating that the subterranean dwellers had been fighting in the darkness for a long time. As creatures that relied on their hearing to distinguish their surroundings, they were much more experienced than the weak humans. Even if the attack caused them to panic, these creatures from the underground of Georgandy Ridge would quickly recover, especially when they relied on the same sound wave to communicate with each other. It was much faster and more effective than humans relying on flags to identify their troops and directions in a chaotic army. In the game, the subterranean dwellers' panic time was much shorter than most other creatures' armies. It was only one round. The goblins had the worst performance in this aspect. Once their formation was disrupted, they would not be able to regroup. The undead were the best, as they did not have the chance to panic. For such creatures, only an excellent army would be able to seize this brief opportunity. Brando's view was that these mercenaries would be eliminated in the first place. The two commanders looked at each other as if they were not convinced, but at this time, Cornelius unsheathed his sword and walked in between them. "I'll listen to you, my lord." The silver-haired middle-aged man looked at the caveman on the riverbank and keenly sensed that something was amiss. He replied, "We're not as experienced as the Count in dealing with these monsters." Brando was slightly startled. He looked at the man and saw the ambition hidden in his silver eyes. However, he smiled in his heart and did not care about the intentions of these three commanders. As long as they had such expectations, they would naturally submit. "It's good that you understand. I don't have much time to explain." He lowered the tip of his sword and replied, "Then carry out my orders." He turned around and faced the direction of the river. The three commanders fell silent. "What about you, my lord?" The red-haired female commander, Yura, asked worriedly. She did not understand why this young man wanted them to fight the subterranean dwellers head-on. The subterranean dwellers were an army of more than 200, perhaps even close to 300. Even if Erwin's Southern Legion had 500 men, they would not dare to say that they could stop the subterranean dwellers head-on, let alone the scattered mercenaries under them. "I already have a target." Brando looked at the riverbank and replied, "Over there." The Nightsong Tiger and his cavalry charged towards the 30 subterranean dwellers and earth spirit bugbears. The subterranean dwellers seemed to want to turn around and deal with the new enemies, but Brando's two pristine angels had already removed their disguise and used their wings of light to entangle the subterranean dwellers from behind. The battle on the riverbank became extremely intense. The 2 silver-ranked angels and 3 silver-ranked earth spirit bugbears were evenly matched, but with the subterranean dwellers, it was difficult for them to gain the upper hand. But that only lasted for a moment, and the situation quickly changed, because Brendel had already put down his sword and charged forward. The young man shot out of the forest like an arrow, and when he landed on the riverbank, he had already shortened the distance between him and the battlefield by half. When he landed on the ground and leaped up again, he was like a phantom that shot into the midst of the subterranean dwellers. In the eyes of the mercenaries who put down their crossbows and walked out of the forest, their young count seemed to have turned into a flickering black light. As he moved forward, his black swallow-tailed coat fluttered like a cape swaying in the wind. In the blink of an eye, the flag had cut between the adventurers, the archangels, the troglodytes, and the bugbears who were acting as bait. A few of the subterranean dwellers reacted and turned around to intercept the enemy. But just as they raised their weapons, Brando had already bypassed their weapons like a phantom and approached a Earth Spirit Bugbear in the middle of the battlefield. The Earth Spirit Bugbear was extremely alert. It shook its furry ears and subconsciously turned its hand. It swung the flail in its hand at Brando, but this move was too slow in the eyes of the young man. The latter stopped to avoid the spiked iron ball, grabbed the cold iron chain, and flew high up in the air. Then, he let go, somersaulted in the air, and landed steadily. He landed on the broad and thick shoulder of the Earth Spirit Bugbear. The entire process was completed in a single breath, in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. The mercenaries blinked and saw Brando half kneeling on the broad shoulder of the Earth Spirit Bugbear. He calmly used both hands to stab the sword into the Earth Spirit Bugbear's throat. An arrow of blood, as dazzling as the broken flag on the riverbank that afternoon. Brando pulled out the sword, and the earth spirit bugbear let out a low howl. Its tall body swayed, and then fell down with a crash. There was a moment of silence on the battlefield. The mercenaries who saw this scene seemed to have forgotten the existence of time and the world around them. They subconsciously stopped, and the breath in their chests seemed to carry some kind of bloody, dry, and a trace of legend. However, although the person who commanded them also had his eyes on the young man, they could not forget the environment at this moment. Rabin took a step forward, cutting off the line of sight between his subordinates and Brando. He swung his greatsword forward and ordered in a deep voice, "Speed up, line up, forward, don't let the enemy come ashore." Rabin turned back, and in his eyes, the subterranean dwellers had regained their order at this moment. These creatures from Jorgandi Ridge seemed to be able to communicate with each other through some kind of transmission in the air. Under the command of only a dozen purple-red subterranean dwellers, these monsters that were still in a mess under the rain of arrows had already gathered the moment the mercenaries stepped out of the forest. They seemed to be ready to move forward again. The whole process took less than half a minute. Rabin realized that Brando's decision to stop their charge was a wise one. If they had charged forward, they would have to face the subterranean dwellers before they even reached the riverbank. However, the mercenaries who started the charge did not stop so easily. Rabin did not need to think to know how high the chances of winning would be if they lost their formation and fought against opponents who were much stronger than them. He turned his head sideways and saw Cornelius and Jutta, who were maintaining order in the middle of the battlefield and on the other side of the battlefield. Who the hell is that young man? Rabin thought. Karsuk's Highland wizard and knight have such an excellent descendant. Those guys are no better than the average nobles. But when he thought back to the battlefield, he still felt that this confrontation was not very optimistic. Although the young man's judgment was correct again and again, the subterranean dwellers in front of them were getting more and more difficult to defeat. Even if the subterranean dwellers lined up on the riverbank and waited for the exhausted soldiers to arrive, Rabin did not believe that they could withstand even the first wave of the enemy's charge. He raised his hand, and the warriors in the first row lowered their shields. At the back were the warriors and swordsmen who were temporarily acting as spearmen, while the professional archers and crossbowmen were reloading their weapons. However, the previous volley of arrows did not cause much damage to the subterranean dwellers, and it was hard to say how effective it would be at this moment. At most, it was a psychological comfort. Sure enough, after the first volley of arrows, the number of subterranean dwellers that fell was less than 10. The subterranean dwellers and the bugbears maintained their formation as they waded through the river. The sound of the water splashing was like the approaching death march. At this moment, not only Rabin, but he also saw the hesitation on his men's faces. They were wavering. With less than 100 feet left, the crossbowmen fired their third volley of arrows. Vern could clearly see that the weak arrows hit the thick fur of the earth spirit bear and bounced off, having almost no effect. 50 feet. Jutta gritted her teeth and stood in front of her men. She thought that even though she was not strong enough, she could at least reduce the impact of the subterranean dwellers on her men. Those who called her big sister were also her brothers and sisters. For the first time in her life, she felt a little regretful and doubted if she had made the wrong choice. She turned back to look at Brendel's direction and saw that he had just killed the second earth spirit bear, but he did not even look at them. She wondered if he was like the other nobles and did not care about their lives. 20 feet. Cornelius could almost see the wrinkles on the skin of the subterranean dwellers. He was sweating profusely as he gripped his sword tightly. In the next moment, two armies, or rather, they were not armies. In short, the mercenaries and the subterranean dwellers clashed. However, the result was out of everyone's expectations. At that moment, the battlefield lost all sound. Everyone was shocked. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 259. When the mercenaries realized that the subterranean dwellers had crashed into their shields, there was no sound at all. The huge force was silent, and the mercenaries in the front row were suddenly thrown to the back row. The entire process was like a pantomime. Everyone was stunned. Yuta turned her head, and her flame-like hair swayed violently in the crowd. She saw Brando on the other side of the battlefield lowering his hand. At that moment, 6 silencing spells accurately covered the entire battlefield. The subterranean dwellers immediately fell into endless panic. After losing the ability to judge the sound, these creatures from the underground of Jorgandi Ridge were like blind men. It was like a person who had lost all perception of the surrounding world in an instant. Their first reaction was either to retreat subconsciously, or to wave their spears in front of them in a futile attempt to protect themselves. The chaos quickly spread among the subterranean dwellers. Thus, the subterranean dwellers in the front row collided with those in the back row, or they were treated as enemies by their own people. They panicked and fled in all directions, or they fought with their own people. Although many mercenaries were involved in the chaos, most of them were free to fight. After a short moment of shock, they immediately realized that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. Victory seemed to be within their reach. So that's how it is. That was the only thought that flashed through everyone's mind. Brando threw away the exhausted soul crystal in his hand. The young lord glanced at them, as if he had already predicted the outcome of the battle. So that's how it is. Rabin was enlightened when he saw the expression on the young noble's face. These fools actually have such a weakness. Cornelius calmly replied. The silver-haired middle-aged man stared at the situation on the front line and immediately ordered a change of flag. The red flag that represented the charge was now fluttering high above the battlefield. The mercenaries in the front did not need to hear the order. They only needed to see the eye-catching flag to know what to do next. The warriors threw away their shields and drew their weapons from below. A moment ago, they were still on the defensive, but now their roles had changed. It was as if an invisible wave swept across the battlefield, and the mercenaries began to counterattack. The blind subterranean dwellers were unable to stop the organized attacks of the humans. Although they were strong, it was futile if they could not hit the enemy. Moreover, in the darkness, they had an instinctive fear in their hearts, causing them to retreat in panic as soon as they were attacked. The front line of the subterranean dwellers began to crumble amidst the chaos. However, the subterranean dwellers who were supervising the battle from the rear could not effectively receive any information from the front line. In their perception, the range of the silent spell was like a black hole that devoured all sound feedback. All the subterranean dwellers who entered the range of the black hole were defeated in an instant. The retreat of nearly 100 subterranean dwellers on the front line caused the entire subterranean dweller army to waver. Even though the subterranean dwellers had retreated from the area of effect of the silent spell, hundreds of their own kind were running away. At first, it was only the subterranean dwellers, but when the subterranean dwellers realized that they had lost the battle, they began to turn around, followed by the bugbears. In the end, the escape turned into a rout. But in reality, the real battle wasn't so one-sided. Under the first wave of attacks by the mercenaries, less than 20 subterranean dwellers had fallen. Their corpses were scattered all over the riverbank, allowing the river water to soak them. But at this moment, the subterranean dwellers didn't have the mood to turn back and count their casualties. They only obeyed the fear in their hearts and ran toward the other side of the river. There was no formation or organization, and they were like a pile of loose sand pushing each other forward. Many of the subterranean dwellers were trampled to death by their own kind, leaving behind a trail of corpses. The mercenaries changed their formation as soon as they got out of the silent spell's range. Under Janna's command, they split into 3 groups and chased after the fleeing subterranean dwellers. Most of the mercenaries were happy to see this kind of fighting style, even though they could not believe that it was actually happening. The battle had completely changed in just one exchange. Just like what Brando said, this was just a warm-up battle. On the other side, at the edge of the forest, the remaining 30 subterranean dwellers were surrounded by the Nightsong Tiger's cavalry. With the 3 earth spirit bugbears killed by Brando, the subterranean dwellers had no choice but to face 2 silver-ranked archangels and twice the number of humans. The outcome of the battle was obvious. Brando did not need to look anymore. He turned around and saw the mercenaries chasing after the fleeing subterranean dwellers. The young man snorted. These mercenaries were still cautious even until now. It seemed like they were still wary of the remaining subterranean dwellers in the lumber mill. He estimated their speed and frowned. At this rate, the subterranean dwellers would definitely escape into the lumber mill. Although the subterranean dwellers were battered and exhausted, they did not suffer any serious injuries in the previous battle. Less than a quarter of the subterranean dwellers were dead, and the earth spirit bugbears were still alive. If they managed to escape, it would be a waste of effort. Fortunately, when he looked at the forest on the other side of the river, he finally saw that familiar figure. The red-haired girl with a ponytail galloped through the forest like a bolt of lightning. It was Scarlet. In fact, it was not only Brando. Cornelius, Gyure, and Rabin also noticed the change on the other side of the river. They did not know when the red-haired girl had gone around the river. The girl was riding on a silver-white magic horse. She held a halberd in one hand and charged out of the forest with a long arc of lightning. It was obvious that her target was the lumber mill. But before that, she blocked the escape route of the subterranean dwellers. "Get out of the way." Yuta was stunned. She did not know why, but when she saw the red-haired girl blocking the path of hundreds of subterranean dwellers, her heart skipped a beat. There were hundreds of subterranean dwellers, including the earth spirit bugbears. Their survival instincts would probably trigger their ferocious nature. Even a gold tier might not be able to escape unscathed in such a situation. Moreover, if they forced the subterranean dwellers to turn around, their previous victory would be in vain. However, Scarlet did not move, as if she did not hear anything. In the next moment, countless green light spots appeared in the forest behind her. They were the wind spirit spiders. Every mercenary present could recognize these little creatures that were under Brando's command. They also knew how powerful they were. Yuta was stunned. The wind spirit spiders began to attack. Under Brando's command, they began to systematically force the subterranean dwellers to turn around. Every time a beam of light flashed, a subterranean dweller would fall to the ground. The subterranean dwellers were unable to resist the silver tier attack, but they soon realized that the right side of the formation was the hardest to attack. Hence, everything that happened next became natural. When the remaining 20 wind spirit spiders led the sacred swords to attack, the frightened subterranean dwellers could only scream and flee into the forest from another direction. The red-haired girl stood motionless in the middle of the subterranean dwellers, but none of them dared to attack her. They could only obediently go around her like water flowing past a reef. Scarlet did not attack. She waited until the last subterranean dweller disappeared into the forest. Then, she turned around and looked at the mercenaries who were chasing after her. She pulled the magic reins and stopped the silver warhorse she was riding on. Scarlet's amber eyes reflected the scene of the caveman in the lumber mill hurriedly closing the door on the wooden fence outside the lumber mill. She smiled faintly. Her eyes flashed with a hint of eagerness. Then, she raised her halberd and swung it forward. With a loud bang, everyone saw the lumber mill's gate being lifted high into the air and then falling apart. How troublesome. Amandina frowned as she looked at the scene. She broke the gate, and we'll have to find someone to fix it later. Really, she didn't think about it properly. Amandina walked out of the forest after the battle ended. The previous battle did not affect her at all, or perhaps she was already used to such a life. Let her be. Brando smiled. He looked up and saw the golden light that filled the sky flying towards him. It was about 10,000 EXP, enough to push his mercenary's EXP bar forward by a little bit, more than 10%. Amandina did not reply after hearing Brando's words. She watched as Scarlet led the mercenaries into the lumber mill from the east. The remaining subterranean dwellers were no match for the mercenaries and Scarlet. The outcome of the battle was set. "It's hard to imagine," Amandina said softly. "These creatures from the Underdark are actually so weak against certain types of magic. Logically speaking, they should know their own weaknesses very well." "You can't say that." The Nightsong Tiger came over from the other side of the battlefield and said, "Miss Amandina." Amandina turned her head, and a hint of doubt flashed in her eyes. "The subterranean dwellers are not a single organization in Jorgendi Ridge." Brando replied, "Jorgendi Ridge is like a huge kingdom, and different creatures form this underground kingdom. Other than the bugbears, there are also harpies and kobold shamans who fight side by side with the subterranean dwellers. Not to mention that the subterranean dwellers have their own witch doctors. But in this small tribe, it's hard to find one. So naturally, they are inferior to us when it comes to magic. So few. Based on the ratio of 1 mage to 1,000 people, this ratio is not small." Brando replied. Amandina nodded and lowered her head to think, "But I didn't expect there to be such a kingdom under Jorgendi Ridge. It's completely different from what I know from the books. Even though I know about the subterranean dwellers, I used to think that it was a barren land that civilization could not reach. It turns out that the world is so mysterious." Brando smiled. Amandina lived in the Cruz culture where the majority of the people were humans, so it was normal for her to have such a misconception. But from the perspective of a player, this world was unimaginably huge. But just the subterranean dwellers alone are so fierce. Amandina frowned. Compared to the skeleton soldiers of Madara, they are much more powerful. "I didn't know that we had such a threat underground. One of the characteristics of the creatures in Jorgendi Ridge is their outstanding individual strength. This is related to their environment." Brando shook his head and sighed as he looked at the sawmill. "But you think that the subterranean dwellers are fierce because Erwin is too weak. If the people of Cruz were here, I'm afraid they wouldn't say such things. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 260. Even though it was a part of the dark forest that extended into the civilized world, the Bearman's forest itself was not large. It would only take a day or half a day to traverse the forest where the 4 logging sites were located. The sawmill in the west was called the Horseshoe Grass Sawmill, and the news of its loss spread through the entire forest within a few hours along with the subterranean dwellers' retreat. The subterranean dwellers in the forest became restless and restless. At the same time, the news also reached the ears of the subterranean dweller tribe's leader. Tajiv was born from one of the 13 noble bloodlines of the subterranean dwellers. It was a natural choice for a witch doctor. Its skin was darker than the elite warriors of the subterranean dwellers, and its body was covered with long feathers. Those were the feathers of the Dynavals, the spoils of war from the underworld's dark elves. However, it was currently sitting on its bearskin throne and did not have the mood to care about these beautiful feathers. It used its slender fingers to caress a skull with feathers on a wooden stick. It was a little irritated. It became the leader of this tribe 5 years ago and became independent from its father's tribe. However, it ran into trouble when it was fighting for its own territory and had no choice but to migrate with its people. This was not a rare occurrence in the underworld, but it was unexpected that it discovered a path that led to the surface. Even though it was rumored that the surface world was far from a paradise, it still decided to take a risk. After it and its people got used to life on the surface, it began to realize that the humans here were not as scary as it thought. Therefore, it took over the 4 logging sites in the forest. However, this action attracted the wrath of the local lord. Of course, it was Baron Grodin. The humans and the subterrane dwellers fought twice in the forest, but Tanagel's mixed army and the noble's private soldiers were no match for the subterrane dwellers. The humans were chased out without gaining any advantage. In the end, Grodin had no choice but to swallow his pride and come to negotiate with it personally. The subterrane dwellers did not need the wood produced in the forest, but Grodin could not. Tanagel was the main source of wood for Ampere Seal, and if there was a problem, the first person to blame would be his powerful father, Count Randner. Grodin had to think of a way to ensure that Trenthium's timber exports would last for a year, even though he was running a deficit. The 4 lumber mills near Abes were among the best in Tanagel, and he did not dare to give them up easily. However, he could not take them back by force, and he could not let Count Randner know about this. Thus, the only way left was to rely on trade. Even though it was unthinkable for a lord to spend money to buy his territory's produce, Grodin still had silver mines in his possession. Since silver was an important currency in the underworld, and Tajiv needed more money to strengthen his tribe, the two of them hit it off, and this secret deal was kept secret from the start. Tajiv appreciated the deal. Even though the subterrane dwellers had won more than once against the humans and even forced Grodin to lower his pride, it did not hide the fact that his tribe had very few people. Thousands of black iron-ranked fighters sounded terrifying, but this was the entire population of his tribe. Tajiv, on the other hand, was very smart. Through constant contact, it gradually understood the reality of the human world it was in. Even though it was impossible to find an army in Tanagel that could easily chase them away, they would not be able to escape unscathed if they appeared in human territory. Baron Abes alone had a population of 70,000, let alone the whole of Tanagel. Moreover, if a foreign race like Tajiv rashly attacked a human settlement, it might lead to an even larger scale attack. It knew that this place belonged to a kingdom, and the concept of a kingdom in Tajiv's mind was equivalent to the underground kingdom of Jorgandi Ridge, which made it fearful. Even though it knew that Grodin had a silver mine, it did not dare to take it over. Tajiv was satisfied with its current situation. As long as it firmly controlled the 3 lumber mills, it would be able to obtain an endless supply of silver from the human lord. With the silver, it would be able to expand its tribe until the day it could return to the underworld. In Tajiv's mind, returning to the underworld was its #1 goal. Even though Tanagel was enviable, it was not the territory of the subterrane dwellers. However, good things did not last long. One day, Tajiv felt that it had encountered a thorny problem. After getting used to a peaceful life, it did not like to engage in war with the humans, especially when the tribe's development was just starting to look good. Since fighting with the humans would attract the attention of the surrounding forces, it did not want to expose its existence. However, the more it thought about it, the more trouble came knocking on its door. Just like this afternoon, it received news from the front lines that humans had once again slaughtered their way into the forest. This time, not only did the humans take over a lumber mill, they also killed more than 100 of its tribesmen. Tajiv was enraged when it heard the news. It ordered its tribesmen who could fight to gather together, but it also calmed down and began to gather information about the humans. The failure at the front had made the wise and cautious subterrane dweller even more cautious. He had gathered all his trusted subordinates here to listen to their opinions. The first to speak was an elderly subterrane dweller draped in bear skin. Of course, from a human's point of view, a subterrane dweller's age was nothing more than a hunchback, weak limbs, and a body full of white stripes. This old subterrane dweller was called Horned Claw. Of course, most subterrane dwellers did not have a name, but this name was given to it by Tajiv. Horned Claw was the name of a bipedal lizard that lived underground in Jorgandi Ridge. They were one of the most famous hunters in the underworld. They were cunning and cunning. Tajiv gave this name to the old subterrane dweller to praise its wisdom and experience. However, the old subterrane dweller was a traitor from an opposing tribe. The subterranean dwellers did not have the concept of two masters like the humans. Subterranean dwellers respected the strong, and it was common for them to defect from one tribe to another. Moreover, Horned Claw was a seasoned veteran, and his words carried a lot of weight in Tajiv's tribe. "I've heard from our former tribesmen that there are wizards among the humans," the old subterranean dweller said. "It's a silent spell. The dark elves often use it against us in the underworld. It's a pity that we don't have more witch doctors at the front lines. Otherwise, we wouldn't have lost so many of our tribesmen." "How many of them do they have?" Tajiv asked. 200 or 300. "Only 200 or 300, the subterranean dweller said gloomily. "That human called Groton must be tired of living. Does he think that I won't dare to touch him just because he sent mercenaries to us?" Tajiv spat. "Let's deal with these reckless mercenaries first, then we'll kill that bastard lord. I don't intend to be polite with him. We'll take over the silver mine in the south." "If we do that," Horned Claw replied, "the humans will retaliate. It's fine. They need time to mobilize. Once we get the silver mine, we'll retreat to the underworld. Let's see if they dare to chase after us," Tajiv replied disdainfully. The few elders in the room exchanged opinions with each other using their unique sound waves. "Then how do we deal with the mercenaries?" another subterranean dweller asked. "I'll personally deal with them," Tajiv replied. "It's just magic." Tajiv stood up and said, "Tonight, I'll make those humans pay the price for our tribesmen's blood." Tajiv's sharp voice echoed in the room. The few subterranean dweller elders lowered their heads and didn't object to it. In their eyes, the humans were indeed reckless. Unlike what Tajiv had purposely spread, there were over 3,000 subterranean dwellers living in the Bearman Forest. In front of such a huge force, even the entire Trendheim army wouldn't be enough to deal with them. Of course, Tonajul might have Count Randner and Erwin behind him. However, Tajiv knew that Groton would not be able to mobilize his troops in such a short time without leaking any information. The only people in Abes right now were the mercenaries that had gathered together. This was the same as the information they received. It seemed that Groton had indeed mobilized the mercenaries to deal with them. However, if Groton thought that he could shake their foundation, he would definitely pay the price. However, Tajiv would never have guessed that Groton had already paid the price for his actions. However, it was not for the subterranean dwellers. The enemy standing in front of them right now was Brando, who was as familiar with them as they were with him. The direction of the battle had changed from the beginning. The battle at the Horseshoe Grass Sawmill had ended long ago. The subterranean dwellers left the camp in full force, leaving behind only the old and weak who were unable to resist. Even so, the mercenaries still paid the heaviest price in the battle for the sawmill. More than 30 were injured, and 10 were killed. Yuda, Rabin, and Cornelius heaved a sigh of relief after the battle was over. They were people who were used to seeing life and death, so this small number of casualties was already somewhat unexpected. No, it was more like a miracle. If it weren't for Brando's familiarity with the underground residents, they wouldn't have been able to win, let alone pay such a small price. However, this battle with the subterranean dwellers was not within their expectations. Therefore, the three great commanders had mixed feelings at this moment. It could be said that they were not so willing to fight for the young lord. Baron Abes's territory shouldn't have anything to do with them, but for some inexplicable reason, they were tied together. Jana, Rabin, and Cornelius couldn't help but look at each other, but there was only bitter laughter in their eyes. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 261. That's ridiculous. The mercenary leader swept her fringe to the back of her head and looked at the mercenaries who were cleaning up the battlefield. I really don't know why we're fighting, but, she sighed, this result is still acceptable. Rabin looked at her and nodded. That young man is indeed outstanding as a noble, he replied. I've been disappointed in the nobles ever since I left Karsuk's army, but he seems to have changed my view of him a little. Being a retainer of a noble isn't necessarily a bad thing for a mercenary, but I'm still a little unwilling to do so. Humph. Cornelius snorted coldly. The silver-haired middle-aged man looked back at the two of them and bluntly said, It's just that your expectations don't match up with reality. If it was Grodin who recruited us instead of this young man, I don't think you would have been unwilling. It's just that our young lord's foundation is still shallow. You and I can see that he wants to use our strength to achieve his own goals. It's hard to avoid suspicion when you think about it, Cornelius said. If he only wants to use my men as a bargaining chip, I won't let him do as he wishes. Grodin is the ruler of a region, but this young man's actions are a little unique, Rabin replied. I don't care what I think of them, but I have to take responsibility for my subordinates. Yuta lightly snorted and turned her head away after listening to their conversation. She was different from the two of them. Her goal in establishing her mercenary group was to unite against the nobles' oppression, but she was disappointed that she had to deal with those filthy nobles. Her goal was to protect her only sister, but now she had lost her sister. She sighed and felt a little lost. She didn't know what goals she had left. But no matter what, she couldn't agree with Cornelius's words. The three of them subconsciously stopped talking and looked at the lumber mill. The Nightsong Tiger and his cavalry were slowly walking in. The young lord had arrived. Every mercenary subconsciously stopped what they were doing and raised their heads to look in that direction. The evaluation of a person's ability among the mercenaries was very simple. It was whether the leader had the ability to lead them to victory. Brando had already led everyone to miraculous victories twice in a disadvantageous situation. There were even rumors about the young lord's mysterious aura, and everyone knew that he was the one they would follow in the future. Cornelius, Yuta, and Cornelius did not stop this from happening. As a matter of fact, even they themselves could not see where this matter would lead them after the battle in Abes that night. But no matter what, if they left Brando, they would have to enter the dark forest. He was a unique and powerful lord who could bring them victory. Even though Count Randner's shadow loomed over them like a dark cloud, there was at least a glimmer of hope. If Brando could bring them victory time and time again despite being at a disadvantage, then who could say for sure what would happen in the future? Even the three captains had a faint trace of blind anticipation in their hearts. Cornelius looked at the people gathered around him. He did not doubt that these mercenaries would cheer when Brando rode into the lumber mill. Mercenaries were not stingy with giving their heroes the highest respect. Their lives of swords and blades had nurtured their hot-blooded and boorish characters. But when the Nightsong Tiger and his riders rode into the lumber mill, everyone was stunned. Where was Brando? Other than the dignified and calm noble lady and the seemingly fearless merchant lady who was swaying on the back of her horse, there was no sign of their lord. What's going on? Yuta was the first to walk up and ask. Amandina glanced at her. It was not the first time the two of them had interacted. However, the experienced mercenary leader was unable to gain the slightest advantage in front of the noble's daughter. Amandina only replied indifferently. My lord has ordered everyone to set up defenses. The subterranean dwellers might finish gathering and attack in the second half of the night. She replied, the silence spell cannot be used again and again. My lord asked the wizards among you not to be stingy with their spell slots. Do your best to reinforce and increase the height of the surrounding fences. You must complete all of this before the Sorcerer King rises into the night sky. Yuta was taken aback. She suddenly realized something and was about to speak, but Rabin, the leader of the Firebrand mercenaries, walked up to her from behind and patted her shoulder to calm her down. The tall man raised his head and looked at Amandina on horseback. Miss Amandina, when will the Lord return? He is the only one here who is most familiar with the subterranean dwellers' tactics and habits. Without him, we might not be able to last through the night. It's fine with me here, Amandina replied. My lord said that if you can last through the night, he will give you a victory. Last through the night. Cornelius frowned. That's easy for you to say, Miss Amandina. From the previous battle, the number of subterranean dwellers in this forest is probably more than 1,000. I don't believe that they would station a third of their forces in the outermost lumber mill. Especially for a tribe that is constantly on the battlefield. Amandina's expression did not change. My lord, there is a price to pay for everything. The Roman added with a smile, for a businessman, risk and opportunity exist together. But my aunt once said that the difference between people is that the smart ones are bold and cautious. My aunt also said that even a small Roman can become a smart person. Cornelius did not reply after hearing this, but he did not refute either. It could be considered as a tacit agreement. What do you think? Yuta turned her head and asked Rabin in a low voice. What else can we do? Rabin replied, that young man doesn't believe us, but he is telling us that he is willing to trust us. Now that the choice is in our hands, it is up to us to decide what to do. The old soldier smiled. What a confident fellow. He's as arrogant as those *T nobles. What do you mean? Amandina was surprised. It means that he doesn't agree with our thoughts. Rabin replied, we think that he wants to rely on us, but that young noble is telling us that he is fine with us, but he is still giving us a chance to choose. Tisk, Yuta glared at Amandina. How arrogant. I hope that he will be able to resolve this matter. If we defend here for a night, he can bring us victory without sacrificing a single soldier. Does he really think that he is a benevolent king? Amandina snorted lightly. Rabin shook his head. He knew that Amandina was talking about how King Eric subdued the Highlanders, but he seemed to have thought of something and did not reply. No one knew where Brando was at this moment. Both sides were busy mobilizing their forces. Tajiv had ordered his tribesmen to split into two groups and pass through the Bearfolk forest. Countless subterranean dwellers and earth goblins were moving forward along the mountain stream. From afar, they could see a vast expanse of gray. There were also a few goblin knights in the midst of the horde. They were not creatures of the underworld, but the goblins and subterranean dwellers who had allied together. However, Brando pretended that he did not see them. He placed one hand on the trunk of a beech tree and looked down the slope. He saw the subterranean dwellers gathering into a long gray dragon in the valley. There are so many of them. The red-haired girl stood quietly behind him. When this scene was reflected in her amber eyes, she couldn't help but sigh softly. There are more than 1,000 of them here, right? I knew that the Baron didn't know how many enemies he had. That idiot. Brando nodded. He and Scarlet had been riding on the silver warhorse for a few hours now. They chased after the subterranean dwellers. These creatures that came from the underworld of Jorgendy Ridge and lost their sight in the dark would not know that there were two people and a horse chasing after them. This was a natural disadvantage for the creatures of the underworld of Jorgendy Ridge. These creatures that were used to living in the dark would not be able to adapt to the light of day. They either did not have sight and relied on their blind sense, or their limited vision in the day would make it difficult for them to see things in the sky. It was important to note that almost all the scouts in Wone's underworld flew in the sky. The young man looked up and saw the faint colors of the clouds. It was still early, and the subterranean dwellers would not be able to complete their attack on the sawmill until after midnight. There are so many of them, Scarlet frowned as she looked down at the valley. Even Commander Makarov would be helpless against them. But what should we do? She raised her head and looked at Brendel. It seems that the subterranean dwellers' tribe is in front of the sawmill. Brando did not answer her question. Scarlet was stunned and turned around. We will depart from here. We can't approach from the sky anymore. I didn't expect the subterranean dwellers to have recruited the goblins nearby. Brando said. My lord, you are thinking of. Scarlet's amber eyes flashed with surprise. Isn't that too daring? Don't worry, it's not the first time I've done this. Brando turned back and smiled. But I need your help, Scarlet. Scarlet sighed. It's an order, my lord. Very well, as you wish. Brando looked at the girl with a red ponytail and nodded. I order you to help me, Scarlet. Then. The red-haired girl raised her head. There's an old saying in my hometown, Brando replied. To catch bandits, first catch the ringleader. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 262. The sky darkened bit by bit. The sunset glow penetrated half of the sky. The thread-like cirrus clouds looked like they were on fire. They changed from a line of bright gold on the horizon to a purplish blue, then gradually turned into a dark blue, all the way to the easternmost part of the sky, turning into a gloomy shadow. The clouds seemed to indicate that the weather would be good for the next few days. Nature had quieted down, and only the chirping of birds could be heard in the forest. Scarlet stood alone beside him, her eyes reflecting a faint layer of twilight. She looked towards the direction of Mount Greyhar, the root system that extended from the Carinaw Mountains to the north and surrounded the entire Ferber barony. At the same time, it was also the easternmost edge of the Black Forest that lay beyond the borders of Aween's southern civilization. Legend had it that this mountain was the source of the land's wealth. There were countless treasures buried beneath it, such as silver. In just a few days, Scarlet had heard rumors about this huge silver mine. Even though only a small part of it was in Tonagel, it was enough for Grodin to spend freely. But this mountain, which was sacred and silent in the eyes of the locals, seemed to be hiding a huge beast in her eyes at this moment. Although the towering rocks exposed the crown of the trees reflected a golden light under the sun, the shadow of the forest hid a secret that no one knew. The sawmill in the forest was like a round spot in the reddish-gold canopy during autumn. Looking down from the top of the mountain, it seemed that there were not many subterranean dwellers. But that was not the case. The subterranean dwellers from Georgandy Ridge had hollowed out the entire mountain, and there were many tunnels and entrances under the rocks. To enter the valley, it was difficult to avoid passing through these areas that were closely monitored by the subterranean dwellers. Scarlet turned her head back. It had been a few hours since Brando confirmed the plan, but they did not move further than a few hundred feet along the valley. In fact, it was only under her constant urging that the young lord unwillingly moved his position. But Brendel did not explain why he had been standing there motionless for a few hours, and often just answered with a faint smile. This guy. The red-haired girl didn't show any reaction on the surface, but she turned around and lightly kicked the tangled roots of the black pine. Since the plan had been confirmed, what was she waiting for? Whether it's that, to catch bandits, first catch the ringleader, or an assassination, how long do I have to wait? She frowned, not liking the feeling of wasting time at all. She turned around and saw the subterranean dwellers coming out of the forest one by one. This was the second batch. The first batch had already entered the forest. Are they going to meet up with the others first, or are they going straight to the sawmill? There were thousands of subterranean dwellers in front of them. If they were to head straight for the sawmill, they would arrive earlier than expected. If that was the case, would the mercenaries be able to last until midnight? She was very doubtful. I don't know. Brando's answer was concise and comprehensive. Shifeng truly had no idea. He wasn't a military genius, and he was only familiar with the habits of the subterranean dwellers. As for what the other party's decision would be, Shifeng had no idea. Then my lord, the sun is about to set. Didn't you say that we would wait until evening? Brando was surprised. Did I say that? Of course, you said at that time. Oh, Brando interrupted her. That's because I saw that you were impatient, so I wanted you to relax. The red-haired girl stared at him with her amber eyes. Even if she had a good temper, she couldn't help but reveal her white canine teeth. I'm sorry. Brando smiled. Scarlett remained silent and turned around. After all, Brando was the Lord, and she saw herself as his subordinate. Of course, a subordinate could not question the Lord's will. So even if she had doubts, she could only keep them in her heart. But Brando would explain his thoughts to his people most of the time, and today seemed a little strange to her. But it wasn't that Brando didn't want to say it, it was that he couldn't. He smiled as he tapped the Shire of Rhodes market in the space he created. 6 wealth was transferred to all his resources. Since that night of squandering, his wealth had risen to 98 points in the past 3 days. But compared to what he had already spent, this recovery was like a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. Do you plan to go down to the underground cave to find their chieftain? He thought for a moment and answered. The subterranean dwellers have probably dug out the entire mountain. If we go down there, we won't be able to find them for a year. But we can't just wait like this. Scarlett complained. Don't worry, this is just a small tribe. The chieftain of a tribe of about 3,000 people is usually a witch doctor. Brando replied. To deal with an official human wizard, he has to come personally. Then how long do we have to wait? It depends on how cautious they are. Brando answered. At the latest, it won't be more than a little after the moon rises. Can they hold off the subterranean dwellers for that long? Scarlett couldn't help but ask. I believe in Amandina. Brando raised his head. I've already given her the method. The rest will depend on whether the mercenaries are willing to stand with us. But if they can't, they have ways to protect themselves. But in reality, it doesn't matter whether they give up on the lumber mill or not. The outcome of this small conflict has already been decided in the battle this afternoon. What do you mean? Just wait and see. Brando smiled. What I want is not as simple as victory. The moon quickly rose into the sky. Under the night sky, the lumber mill was filled with the smell of silence. But this could not be hidden from the experienced mercenaries. When Yuta was patrolling the lumber mill, she had already sniffed out the unusual smell hidden in the wind. The subterranean dweller scouts have probably arrived. She frowned and raised her hand subconsciously. Her fingers dug into her fiery red hair behind her right ear and combed it back against the night wind that was gradually cooling down. She waved her left hand and called for a few mercenaries to scout the forest. However, her actions had attracted the attention of the others in the camp. Cornelius, the leader of the Rose and Wine mercenary group, raised his head and glanced at her. He then turned his head back and continued to supervise his men as they dug a trench in the camp. It was not a trench, but a precautionary measure to prevent the subterranean dwellers from ambushing them from underground. As for the tall and sturdy Captain Verne, he was also silent. He gestured for his men to climb up the wooden wall. Amandina, who was patrolling the camp, heaved a sigh of relief when she saw the mercenaries' orderly and experienced actions. After inspecting the lumber mill, the noble daughter lifted her skirt and walked up the wooden wall with the company of her 2 wild elf sisters. She first looked at Yuta, who was standing under the moonlight. Did you find anything? Amandina asked. Yuta turned her head and saw that it was Amandina. She did not seem surprised, but she did not seem to be interested either. There are things in the forest. Perhaps they are subterranean dwellers or other beasts. I've already sent people to check it out. Subterranean dwellers. Amandina was slightly surprised, but she did not show it on her face. They came so quickly. Perhaps. Amandina emphasized. What if they did? Amandina took a light breath and calmed herself down. Does this mean that the subterranean dwellers are moving quickly, Commander Yuta? Also, can you determine their reaction speed and the coordination between the armies? Amandina was knowledgeable, but after following Brando for a period of time, she felt that the knowledge she learned was shallow. In front of these experienced mercenaries, experience and knowledge were often beneficial. She looked at Yuta and asked humbly. Yuta also looked at her. For the first time, she felt that this little girl was not as annoying as she thought. Even though she was a little more thoughtful at a young age, she had seen many descendants of the so-called nobles, so she didn't find it strange that she accepted them. The battlefield is ever-changing, and there is rarely any definite information. Amandina shook her head, her red hair swaying like a flame. It could be a subterranean dweller that was left behind to monitor us, or it could be a scout that came from behind. If it is the former, it means that the other party is very skilled in battle. If it is possible, I do not want to be entangled with such a person. But if it is the latter, it means that the other party's overall reaction speed and coordination are superior. If this is the case, then the next few days will be very difficult, and at least it means, Yuta added, that the scout was able to cross the forest in such a short period of time. His individual strength is not ordinary. Which do you think it is, Commander Yuta? Based on experience, Amandina replied, I am more inclined towards the latter. Experience. Experience is very important, Miss Amandina, especially when you're unsure of something. Experience is like an intuition, and it's more reliable than your knowledge. Jano licked her lips as she looked ahead. A flock of birds was startled in the forest, indicating that the mercenaries and the subterranean dwellers had fought and were chasing them away. Amandina narrowed her eyes. It seems that my guess was not wrong. Your lord is not an ordinary person. What? Amandina looked back in surprise. If the scout is here at this time, it means that the main force is near. Yuta replied, but in terms of time, the attack will be delayed. The real intense battle will last until the second half of the night. That little guy. Oh, I'm sorry. My lord seems to be quite familiar with these subterranean dwellers. He knows more than that. Amandina looked at the moon and replied faintly. Oh. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 263. Amandina could hear the faint sounds of birds flapping their wings in the forest, and she could not help but feel a chill run down her spine. Jana stood beside her. The two ladies, one big and one small, stood silently on the wooden wall, facing the cold moonlight. Who knew what dangers lurked in the darkness? Amandina could imagine the subterranean dwellers leaping through the forest. Their heavy footsteps made crisp crackling sounds as they stepped on the withered pine branches. They quickly appeared from the dark forest and surrounded the lumber mill. The subterranean dwellers appeared from the direction of Mount Greyhar. There were about 30 of them, and they were the same as the ones in the afternoon. The mercenary scouts were obviously no match for them. Fortunately, Amandina had already considered this point. She had sent out cavalry, so they could at least retreat from the forest. The subterranean dwellers followed closely behind the cavalry. They knew that the humans would retreat back to the lumber mill, and if the humans in the lumber mill opened the gates to receive them, they would have a chance to kill their way in. However, Yuta would not make such a low-level mistake. She immediately ordered the crossbowmen to stop the subterranean dwellers with a rain of arrows. At the same time, she ordered her own men to open the gates and let the cavalry in. The crossbowmen released the bowstrings on their crossbows, and a row of white arrows shot out from the wooden walls outside the lumber mill. The uniform crossbow bolts were like an invisible whip lashing out at the subterranean dwellers' formation, causing them to fall into disarray. Amandina saw with her own eyes that the subterranean dwellers that were shot down crawled back up from the ground. There were only 5 or 6 of them that fell. Amandina could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Even though she had fought with the subterranean dwellers in the afternoon, she was with the Roman at the back. She did not see the battle as clearly as she did now. But no matter what, the subterranean dwellers left behind 5 or 6 corpses and retreated quickly. They are scouts. The female mercenary leader stared at the direction where the subterranean dwellers had retreated to and confirmed this. Then this is the first group of subterranean dwellers that appeared in the afternoon, Amandina whispered. If they did not gather together, then these are the subterranean dwellers that came from the nearest sawmill. They did not gather together. How did you know? Yuta turned around. This little girl was just asking her a question, but she came to her own conclusion so quickly. The guide from ABE said that it would take the better part of a day, even on horseback, to get here from the sawmill, she said matter-of-factly. You can see that the troglodytes were not as fast as horses. The vanguard, Yuta replied. They probably know that we don't have many people. Amandina replied, so many escaped in the afternoon, it's impossible for them to hide their strength. However, the 2 of them did not dwell on this matter. It was obvious that they had no chance of defeating each other in the afternoon. In fact, if it weren't for Brando's strategy, it would have been impossible for them to even win. However, the 2 of them quickly stopped talking. After the subterranean dwellers' scouts retreated, the subterranean dwellers' vanguard quickly came out from the other side of the forest. There were about 100 subterranean dwellers that came out from the forest and moved along the riverbank. What are they doing? A face came between the 2 of them. Romaine's eyes widened like a pair of black gemstones. She blinked and leaned against the parapet to look at the long line of subterranean dwellers. They're surrounding this place, Amandina furrowed her brows. It seems like they're waiting for the other subterranean dwellers to arrive. Are they looking down on us? Humph. Yuta looked at the long line of subterranean dwellers on the riverbank and felt a little restless. Should we let the Nightsong Tiger lead the cavalry to charge at them? She thought that if they opened the gate and charged out, they would definitely gain a huge advantage. Amandina watched as the subterranean dwellers slowly moved along the riverbank and slowly turned the sawmill into an isolated island. It was impossible for her to not feel nervous. However, she calmed down and shook her head. No need. If they're going to surround us, it means that they won't attack for a while. Isn't that what we want? If we weaken them a little, it will be easier to defend later. Yuta looked at Amandina. Amandina's calmness left a strange impression on her, but she shook her head. But you're right. We might have to face 1,000 or more of these subterranean dwellers. It doesn't matter if there's 100 more or less, and we don't have the confidence to wipe them all out. Amandina spoke as if she was trying to convince herself. Amandina did not reply, but she thought in her heart, 1,000. She secretly shook her head. Brando told her that there were more than 3,000 subterranean dwellers in this area. But the greater the number, the slower it would take for them to gather. She estimated that the number of subterranean dwellers outside the sawmill would be more than half of this number. The only thing left was to hope that the subterranean dwellers were not good at fighting on the surface like Brando said. Amandina was a little nervous, but on the other hand, Brando had never boasted before. The silver moon rose higher and higher in the mountains. When the moonlight illuminated the valley, Brando finally found his target. He squinted his eyes and saw a skinny subterranean dweller witch-doctor surrounded by a few large bugbears. Even though they disappeared into the sea of people in the blink of an eye, he had already memorized their approximate location. It was already past midnight. He immediately reset the card, the Market of the Shire of Rhodes, and tapped it again, transferring 6 points of wealth into the treasure. After doing all this, he lowered his head and looked at the subterranean dwellers gathered in the Silver Valley. The number of subterranean dwellers was astonishing, and they were divided into 3 groups. He guessed that at least half of the subterranean dwellers in this area were stationed under the sawmill. Looking at the densely packed spears, Brando could not help but frown. The bad news was that he and Scarlet had no choice but to find a target in this army. Even if both of them were gold-level rank 1, it was still impossible for them to move freely among hundreds and thousands of iron-level creatures. The good news was that it was easier than going around in circles in the underground tunnels dug by the subterranean dwellers. Brando had once been a hot-blooded, impulsive person. He and his companions in the game were like Scarlet, charging in without any hesitation. The difference was that he was here to stop the red-haired girl, but there was no one to stop them at that time. Of course, the result was that they were lost for almost a week. He stood up and waved at Scarlet, who was bored out of her mind. "Come with me. You're making a move." The red-haired girl was stunned. Brando nodded. The two slid down the hillside silently. The dense growth of the subterranean tree hid their figures, but it was unnecessary. The subterranean dwellers did not rely on their eyesight. Their sharp hearing allowed them to catch the light footsteps of humans from hundreds of meters away. But that was only for ordinary people. When Brando and Scarlet came out of the forest one after another, the first to notice them were the bugbears at the edge of the forest. The bugbears with flails were obviously shocked when they saw the man and woman. They rarely experienced such a situation. At first, they took a little time to think about how to deal with the situation, but then they immediately let out a deep roar. The roar echoed throughout the valley. Clang! Brando cut the meteor hammer that was flying towards him in half with his sword. He tilted his head slightly and let the weapon fly past him. Then he looked up again. Probably realizing that their attack did not work and guessing the opponent's strength, the subterranean dwellers and the bugbears in his field of vision became restless. The news spread like a plague among these strange creatures, but the transmission of the news took time, and the reaction took even more time. But Brando had calculated the distance between him and the subterranean dweller witch doctor. He flicked the blade of his sword with his left middle finger and leveled it, drawing a long silver line from left to right. The wind pressure was released from the blade. It first passed through the few bugbears like wheat stubble left behind by a scythe. These burly bugbears fell like scarecrows and were cut in half at the waist. Blood spurted out from their wounds. A large number of subterranean dwellers were swept away. The attack scared the subterranean dwellers. Although the division of strength between Georgandy Ridge and the surface world was different, the strength of a gold rank 1 was enough to create a deterrent effect no matter where it was. The subterranean dwellers immediately screamed in horror. To Brando, it sounded like meaningless noise and screams. They then retreated like a receding tide away from Brando. This was even more exaggerated than in the game. Although there was such a thing as morale in the game, it wasn't as ridiculous as this. Brando didn't expect his attack to have such an effect. Even he was surprised. However, this was a good thing. He immediately followed the direction where the subterranean dweller retreated. Scarlet followed closely behind. At this moment, Witch Doctor Tajiv finally discovered the source of the chaos. It shook its huge head, which was unique to subterranean dwellers. At first, its mind was filled with anger and dissatisfaction towards its subordinates. 2 mere humans were able to mess up the team that it had painstakingly assembled. However, it immediately realized that the 2 humans were coming in its direction. And it was extremely fast. It knew this from the feedback of the sound waves it emitted. In just a few breaths, the distance between them had shrunk by several tens of meters. This was not a good sign. Tajiv panicked. P.S. I think everyone should be as unhappy as I am right now. Chapter 264. However, after a brief moment of chaos, the subterranean dwellers quickly regained their composure. Tajiv's anxious heart finally calmed down. There were many rumors about the people on the surface of the Georgandy Ridge. Some of them described their greed, but there were also legends and stories about how powerful the Surface Empire was. The witch doctor who came from the Georgandy Ridge was deeply influenced by these legends and believed that the surface world was a dangerous and barren world. However, it soon became disdainful because the humans of Tonajil gave it an extremely negative impression. In Tajiv's eyes, the human army was weak, powerless, and lacked discipline. His tribe was one of the weakest in the underworld, but they easily defeated Baron Grodan's army. At first, the subterranean dweller leader was suspicious and thought that the humans had set a trap for them to fall into. When Grodan's envoy secretly came to its door, it even suspected that the human noble outside the forest was lying to it. In the end, Tajiv's suspicions were proven to be unfounded. It turned out that the legends about the human empire on the other side of the Georgandy Ridge were just stories that were used to scare children. However, greed did fit the description of the human race. After a brief moment of shock, its initial cautiousness was replaced by an inflated ego. It began to expand unscrupulously in the forest and took over all of the lumber mills. It even wanted to use the forest as a foothold to expand and conquer Grodan's territory. However, the humans' terrifying numbers made it give up on the idea. Of course, this did not change Tajiv's impression of the humans as weak. In its opinion, the mercenaries only managed to take over the lumber mills because the enemy's wizards played a miraculous role in the battle. However, as long as it took action, it would be able to teach the enemy a lesson. Those cowardly and greedy humans indeed needed blood and fists to teach them a lesson. Tajiv couldn't help but think angrily. It had already subconsciously treated these surface people as some sort of inferior life form or aboriginals. However, the two humans who dared to attack its army gave it a shock. The subterranean dwellers who retreated from the front lines used their low-frequency screams to inform it that the two humans were very strong, perhaps as strong as a slave master. In the Georgandy Ridge, the title of slave master represented the strength of a gold-ranked creature on the surface world, such as the Minotaurs or the golden dwarves who lived in the labyrinth. Tajiv's hair stood on end. This was an instinctive reaction for the subterranean dwellers. It knew that these two creatures were the fourth-ranked creatures in the hierarchy of the underworld. Even the subterranean dwellers had to look up to them, let alone Tajiv. But now, it was neither the bullhead gladiator with a double-edged axe nor the golden dwarf who lived in the golden hall. Tajiv's armies and Grodan its eyes were humans. Humans were humans were humans were humans were humans were humans. But they are humans who lack probability. They actually dared to challenge the entire army alone. Tajiv didn't really care. It thought that the natives were natives after all. They lacked a systematic battle strategy. In the underworld, war had developed into an art. Even though it had only learned the basics, it was enough to look down on these barbarians. It immediately raised its flag and ordered its own kind to surround the two humans. Even if they were slave masters, it was still impossible for them to fight against an army of humans alone. When the subterranean dwellers started to panic, Brando's attack was still going smoothly. He looked up and saw that among the subterranean dwellers who were moving in all directions, there was a conspicuous goat head emblem. It was the emblem of the subterranean dwellers' tribe leader, and it was only 100 meters away from him. But as the subterranean dwellers retreated, they finally encountered the subterranean dweller warriors behind them. These tall, burly subterranean dwellers with purplish-red tumors on their bodies mercilessly whipped their companions with the spears in their hands to wake them up from their panic and return to their posts. The subterranean dwellers screamed and were driven back. So Brendel soon found himself facing the Georgandy Ridge's regular army that had been driven back. They lined up in a row and tried to pass him a spear with their weak forelimbs, but to be honest, it was hard to say that it was an effective attack. Brando easily swept away these inferior spears. He separated the human wall with his sword and destroyed them again. The first row of subterranean dwellers left 5 bodies covered in a layer of frost and scattered again. The defensive line melted like snow. Brando moved forward for a while, but he immediately saw more subterranean dwellers being driven back. Due to the time that their own kind had bought, these creatures had calmed down. The subterranean dwellers finally reacted. "My lord," Scarlet whispered, intending to tell him that the separated subterranean dwellers had begun to surround them. Brando did not need to turn his head to know what was going on. The sea was pressing in from all directions, but the two of them realized that they were only a dozen meters away from the enemy's formation. Gradually, they started to feel resistance. 2 to 3 subterranean dwellers screamed and ran toward them. Their strong hind legs allowed them to exert great strength on the tip of their spears like a galloping cavalry. This kind of attack was completely different from the previous one. After blocking 2 or 3 attacks, Brando could not help but feel a headache. He saw Tajiv's goat head was moving in the opposite direction. It was either to the north or the northeast. In short, it was difficult to distinguish the direction in the chaos. At first, Brando could not help but reminisce about his first plan. It was a plan that he was tempted by when he was at the top of the mountain. That plan was to ride the silver warhorse and break in from the sky. However, he had completely forgotten about the danger of attacking from the sky. His enemy might be a spellcaster. Brando rarely dealt with subterranean dwellers, but he knew that anti-air spells were not rare. Brando and Scarlet did not show any mercy. Flashing electric arcs and frosty blue ice crystals spread dozens of feet forward, and the third encirclement of the subterranean dwellers was reduced to ashes. However, both of them stopped to catch their breath. Brando felt that he had killed at least 40 subterranean dwellers. Since Scarlet was the only one who shared the experience points, he could absorb 700 to 800 XP from each subterranean dweller. If it were not for the drastic decrease in his stamina, it would have been a glorious battle. Scarlet's face was slightly red, and her forehead was already sweating. Her absolute strength was 10% higher than Brando's, but the young man had always been outnumbered in the game. He had always lived a life of killing in and out of chaotic battles. The players' nearly endless lives allowed them to experiment with all kinds of tactics. Hence, the accumulated experience allowed Brando to preserve his stamina as much as possible in such a situation. However, his face didn't turn red, and his heart didn't skip a beat. When the red-haired girl saw his calm expression, she couldn't help but feel a little admiration for him. As expected of Sir Monarch, she thought. However, Brando calmed himself down and listened to the low-frequency vibrations around him. He used his sword to push back the subterranean dwellers and carefully captured the sound. It sounded like a branch of Draconic, and should not be within the range of human hearing. However, there was a setting in the amber sword that when perceptive sense was increased by 1 Oz, the amount of sound that could be captured by the human ear would increase exponentially. At this moment, Brando's perceptive sense was already as high as 20 Oz. Soon, he heard the unique sound. It was the subterranean dwellers in the army communicating with each other in their special way. They were also relaying orders to the subterranean dwellers. Brando did not understand the subterranean dwellers' language, but he could guess what they meant. He knew that as long as he disturbed the command nodes hidden in the army, the subterranean dwellers would automatically fall into chaos. To the players, this kind of technique was already considered a cliché. He quickly located the source of the sound. He turned his head to the side and sensed that there were 3 to 5 sources of the sound behind the large group of subterranean dwellers. Judging from their movements, they were forming a 4th encirclement. Scarlet, he immediately shouted, open a gap in that direction. Scarlet was slightly stunned. Her blazing amber eyes looked in the direction Brando's sword was pointing. There, the subterranean dwellers were gathering. A large group of more than 100 subterranean dwellers quickly formed an impenetrable defense line. It was obvious that the subterranean dwellers behind them had sensed Brando's killing intent. However, their actions had also attracted Scarlet's attention. Their actions seemed to indicate that there was something important hidden behind the defense line. The girl swung her long red ponytail. Without further prompting, she swung her spear forward. An arc of lightning flashed in the darkness. Dazzling electric sparks pierced through the 3 subterranean dwellers who were blocking the perimeter and immediately penetrated their bodies. The lightning spread out like a fan. After a loud explosion, the subterranean dwellers fell backward in a huge fan shape. The ones in front were charred black, while the ones behind were paralyzed and could not move. When the gap was opened behind the layers of human wall, Brando narrowed his eyes and finally saw the few tall Muri dwellers behind the subterranean dwellers. However, the subterranean dwellers on both sides were closing in. The gap in the human wall was getting smaller and smaller. There was only one chance. He did not hesitate to activate his charge skill. For the first time, he separated from Scarlet, who had been moving back to back. His body instantly turned into a striking black line. The black line shot past the row of subterranean dwellers. The subterranean dwellers only turned around after a few tenths of a second. However, Brando had already leaped over their shoulders and arrived in front of the subterranean dwellers with his sword. There were a total of 6 subterranean dwellers in front of him. The purplish-red skinned creatures were quite smart. When they noticed that the defense line was broken, some of them came forward to block it, but more of them scattered and ran away. However, Brando immediately unleashed his maximum strength and swung his sword. The full power of the White Raven sword style and the explosive strength created a 7-meter-long transparent ripple in the air. Under the cover of the night, the ripple moved forward dozens of meters in an instant. The subterranean dwellers staggered forward, but their heads were immediately separated from their bodies and they fell to the ground. Brando stopped and turned around. The surrounding subterranean dwellers finally retreated because they had lost their leader. I always feel like I'm not good enough to satisfy myself. I wish everyone a happy Children's Day. I'm begging for votes next month. I only got 14 votes after taking a look. I'm tearing up. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 265. A ball of lightning burst out from the darkness like a bright firework. The dazzling electric sparks pierced through the 3 subterranean dwellers and penetrated their bodies. The lightning was like a fan that spread out in all directions. The subterranean dwellers fell to the ground. Tajiv was shocked, but it was not because of the terrifying power of Scarlet's attack. It knew that once one's strength reached the level of a slave master, the lethality of every move would increase exponentially. But what really shocked it was that after Scarlet's attack, the front line seemed to have collapsed. What's going on? Tajiv looked around the battlefield, and it quickly sensed that the voices that had been relaying orders on the battlefield had disappeared. It had lost a few of its own warriors, and these 2 humans seemed to be very familiar with its fighting style. Tajiv was slightly shocked, but it did not have the time to grieve because the 2 humans had started to move forward again. Brando and Scarlet's speed was extremely fast, and the subterranean dwellers who had lost their formation could not stop them. The distance between the 2 sides was quickly reduced by half. Of course, Tajiv wouldn't just sit there and wait for its death. However, it soon realized that the subterranean dweller warriors that it sent forward to organize the attack would often be found out from the crowd and executed with surgical precision. After a few times, it gave up on this effort. Not to mention that this effort was meaningless, it did not have that many elites to expend. After losing nearly half a company of subterranean dweller warriors, the subterranean dweller voodoo doctor was starting to get anxious. Moreover, time did not allow it to think too much. He looked around and saw the tall earth spirit bugbears guarding him. It could not help but think that it was time to let these bugbears play their role. Although these bugbears were the strongest fighting force in the subterranean dwellers, the 2 humans were getting closer and closer, and it did not want to die here for no reason. It made a hand gesture. It was a set of spell elements, blessing of the cave. At the cost of losing sight, it could greatly increase a creature's fighting strength for a short period of time. For the peak iron-ranked bugbears, it was enough to raise their strength to the silver rank. This was, in fact, a type of black magic that was extremely harmful to the target. However, Tajiv did not understand this. The witchcraft of a witch doctor was passed down from their blood. It was the blessing of the cave witches. Every subterranean dweller's witchcraft was the first thing they learned, so they did not need to consider the validity of it. It raised 3 of its withered fingers, sprinkled a handful of plant ashes, and cast a blind blessing. This way, the earth spirit bugbears would be temporarily blinded. At the very least, it wouldn't affect their combat strength when they lost their vision. In fact, every earth spirit bugbear had received special blind combat training, so it wasn't a problem for them. Every inhabitant of the underground had to remember this saying, "Eyes are superfluous." Finally, Tajiv pointed forward and let out a sharp screech from its throat. His order was simple. He wanted the bugbears to stop the 2 humans, or at least stop them. At the very least, he wanted to buy time for his warriors to reorganize the cowardly bugbears. It knew that a human's physical strength was limited. Its sharp hearing had even caught the sound of the woman's heavy breathing. It knew who was going to last longer. But Tajiv believed that victory would belong to the subterranean dwellers. This was the result of his experience in hundreds and thousands of battles. While listening to the goblin bears moving forward with heavy steps, he ordered his personal guards, even though the goblin bears were no longer of the same standard after the goblin bears were gone, to cover his retreat. These 2 damned humans. Tajiv couldn't help but curse in its heart. But at this moment, Brando and Scarlet saw a completely different scene. The red-haired girl felt that she was about to collapse from exhaustion. She had never participated in this kind of battle before. The 2 of them advancing courageously in the midst of an army of 10,000 sounded pretty good. But in reality, her stamina was depleting several times faster than usual. She could already remember how many enemies she had killed. Hundreds or more. At first, it was like a hot knife cutting through butter, but as her stamina gradually depleted, the feeling of advancing courageously was soon mixed with a trace of difficulty. The lightning arcs that extended from her halberd had shrunk from 10 feet long, but now they were only surrounding her body. Scarlet didn't know how long she could last. She couldn't help but look around. There were enemies everywhere. She began to gasp for air as she looked at Brando in admiration. Brendel was the only one who remained calm and composed. His elemental energy was a type of ice powder that was formed from low temperatures, and the subterranean dwellers who were close to him were forced to retreat by the cold. Scarlet gritted her teeth and followed him, unwilling to lose. But she didn't know that Brando was also feeling a little weak. After all, no matter how strong you were in the Amber Sword, as long as you didn't have a perfect body, you would never be able to escape exhaustion. Be it gold rank 1 or elemental activation, there was no exception. The young man's calmness and ease in using his elemental ability were all due to an unexpected surprise. As his level increased, the indomitable ability hidden in his body gradually grew, and more new attributes appeared. And at this moment, he was surprised to find such an indomitable ability. As long as the stamina does not enter the stage of exhaustion, the character can use all his abilities as if he was in his best condition. On the surface, this indomitable ability did not increase a character's absolute strength, but Brando knew that it played a far greater role in actual combat than he had imagined. After all, any player or NPC, as long as they had not reached the stage of perfect body, they would inevitably face the problem of stamina depletion. In other words, except for the real Golden Clan, everyone's absolute strength in combat would gradually decrease. But after obtaining the indomitable ability, the situation had fundamentally changed. This was an unexpected piece of good news. It meant that he would be able to maintain his peak strength at any time in any battle. This was especially true in a long battle or a duel. He would have an absolute advantage. But Brando thought that although this indomitable ability was beautiful, once he reached the perfect body stage, it would become useless again. When he thought of this, he felt a little helpless. He casually swung his sword. The continuous use of the White Raven sword style and power burst had already pushed his stamina to the critical point. But at this moment, Brando raised his head and finally saw the earth spirit bugbears around Tajiv finally moving. Then, he saw a layer of black and red light flashing on the subterrane dweller's body. He recognized that it was the most commonly used skill of the subterrane dwellers, Cave Blessing. The subterrane dweller's mana pool was not large, which meant that the subterrane dweller had begun to use its trump card. That was enough. Brando could not help but let out a sigh of relief. He turned his head slightly. "Scarlet, can you still hold on?" he asked. The red-haired girl casually slapped away a subterrane dweller that was charging at her. She took a deep breath and did not even have the mood to answer this question. She only asked, "Phew. How far do we have to go, my lord?" Her answer had already shown that she was exhausted. But when she turned her head, she saw a row of earth spirit bugbears blocking her way like a tall wall. She was shocked and her face turned pale. She took a deep breath and pulled back her halberd. She gritted her teeth and said, "My lord, I remember that you have the ability to accelerate, right? Charge." Brando was stunned. "Yes, what? I'm already exhausted. I'm afraid I don't have the strength to continue." Scarlet took a deep breath, but when she raised her head, her eyes flashed with an unyielding fighting spirit. She gritted her teeth and said, "I'll use the seventh chord to open up an opening." "My lord, you think of a way to speed up and pass through those earth spirit bugbears. Are they called earth spirit bugbears?" Brando did not expect this to be what she was thinking. He shook his head and said, "What are you talking about?" "I'm asking if you can buy me some time." "Time?" Scarlet was stunned. 30 seconds. The red-haired girl's eyes flashed with doubt, but she still nodded firmly, "Of course." "Then I'll leave it to you." Brando stared at the wall of earth spirit bugbears that was getting closer and closer. In his eyes, Tajiv's goat head was getting farther and farther away. But success seemed to be right in front of him. When Tajiv felt that Brando and Scarlet had stopped, it almost thought that victory was in its hands. It thought that even if they were two slave masters, they would have to be careful in front of more than 20 earth spirit bugbears with the blessing of the cave. However, as long as they slowed down, it would have enough time to reorganize its panicked tribesmen. In this way, the two humans' efforts would be in vain. Tajiv couldn't help but feel proud of its brilliance. However, before it could order the troglodyte warriors to return to the front lines to supervise the fleeing troglodytes, an unexpected situation occurred within its hearing range. It was a sharp premonition of danger that was left over from years of war. Its heart skipped a beat, and it subconsciously raised its head. Although it lacked vision, it could feel that there was an uninvited guest in the air from the feedback of the sound wave. It did not know what it was, but it had never heard of this special echo before. It was soft with a hint of chaos, as if it was stirring up the air and creating a vortex in the wind. It was the sound of wings, but it was much louder than the sound of birds. Tajiv suddenly remembered a legend about the surface world. It thought that it must be a giant eagle, the giant eagle of the elves on the surface world. But at this moment, only Brando, Scarlet, and a few earth spirit bugbears in the army could see that it was not a giant eagle that appeared in the sky, but two shining angels with two pairs of light wings on their backs. The holy archangels descended from the sky. Their target was Tajiv, which was right below them. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 266. Amandina clasped her hands in front of her chest and watched as more and more people walked into the forest. Ever since the month of frost, even though there was still some time before Erwin's first snowfall, the temperature at night was already very low. Everyone exhaled a thin layer of white air in the cold air, forming a cloud over the lumber mill. The soldiers behind the parapet rubbed their hands together to resist the cold. Under the cold night sky, there was a hint of tension and tension. Almost all of the mercenaries were on the wooden walls, and there was no backup. Even though Yuri and Cornelius were against it, Brando personally told her that there was no need for it, and that was the truth for her. What if something unexpected happens? This is putting everyone in danger. Amandina didn't know why, but she suddenly had a naughty thought when she answered the female commander's angry question. If Brando lied to her, she would become a spirit after she died and would haunt him. This sudden thought gave her a big fright. Even her cheeks flushed red, and she felt a little hot. She exhaled and shook her head seriously to drive this thought out of her mind. Yuta looked at the noble girl who seemed to be in a daze and blushed. She shook her head and gave her an answer, "This is the Lord's order." She could not help but throw away the good impression she had for Amandina. Yuta could not help but turn around and leave after hearing such an irresponsible answer. She looked at her subordinates in annoyance and scolded them in her heart before she left. If it was in the past, she would have said it in front of Amandina and not behind her back. In fact, even she herself did not realize that they had been influenced by Brendel for a long time. She did not oppose the idea of sending all of her troops in one go. Since it was the young man's order, then he must have his reasons. Cornelius also stopped objecting with the same thought. But when he turned around, he saw a smile on the tall firebrand mercenary's tanned face. The silver-haired middle-aged man was stunned. "You already knew?" When he asked, he instinctively became alert. Rabin seemed to have seen through the old fox's thoughts. He rubbed his nose carelessly and laughed. "That little girl is calmer than you and me. Do you think she's someone who would randomly give orders? The only one who can order her around is the young overlord. You're quite observant." Cornelius snorted. "Same to you." Rabin's thoughts flashed through his mind, but he did not say it out loud. There was an experienced mercenary beside him who would estimate the number of subterranean dwellers in the forest every once in a while. He listened to the mercenary's voice and did not say a word. Soon, there were thousands of subterranean dwellers. Their restlessness in the forest caused everyone to be on guard. The stars in the night sky were constantly changing, but time had finally passed the first 2 hours after midnight. Amandina was at a disadvantage as she struggled with fatigue and the Roman's strange questions. But just as she was about to yawn, she heard a series of strange sounds. It was the sound of the surrounding mercenaries raising their crossbows. Amandina immediately shuddered. She raised her head and saw that the subterranean dwellers were finally moving. They walked out of the forest in rows, and there were 2 bugbears who raised their huge wooden shields to protect them. "Do you have any siege weapons?" the mercenaries asked each other from the top of the walls. "No. I don't see any." The scout's voice immediately came from the tower. Almost everyone breathed a sigh of relief. My lord guessed it again. Amandina stood behind the parapet and thought to herself with a calm expression. The subterranean dwellers began to speed up when they were about 150 yards away. From the wooden walls, it looked like they were jogging, but the huge wooden shields that formed the surface of the sea were already moving. 100 yards. 50 yards. At this moment, Yuta, Rabin, and Cornelius simultaneously gave the order to fire. Hundreds of crossbows were released at the same time, and the sound of the crossbow bolts made everyone's ears go numb. Everyone saw the dense crossbow bolts forming a translucent white line that swept forward like a blade. The blade swept across the advancing formation of the subterrane dwellers. The 3 rows of subterrane dwellers at the front paused, and the subterrane dwellers and earth spirit bugbears tumbled to the ground. An obvious gap immediately appeared in their formation. But everyone knew that only the heavens knew the true destructive power of the crossbow bolts against the subterrane dwellers. They did not have the time to load the second crossbow bolt, and the subterrane dwellers behind them rushed forward to fill up the gap in front. In just a few moments, the subterrane dwellers had already killed their way to the wooden walls outside the sawmill. The wooden wall was made up of 4 layers of logs, and the space between each layer was filled with mud. For a lumberyard, the 3 commanders thought that the subterrane dwellers were simply wasting their raw materials by building such a fortification. However, when the bugbears raised their wooden shields and rammed into the wall, they began to regret this thought. The heavy subterrane dwellers took huge steps forward, and the weight of the wooden shields in their hands caused the wooden walls to creak. Some of the logs even began to tilt backwards. One had to know that the logs had been driven deep into the ground for nearly a third of their length. Everyone could hear the creaking of the wooden walls under their feet, and it was simply terrifying. In comparison, the subterrane dwellers who stepped on the wooden shields and used their powerful hind legs to leap up the walls were completely harmless. The mercenaries did not hesitate to chase the uninvited guests down the wooden walls, but the subterrane dwellers' attack was not over yet. Soon, the mercenaries on the walls screamed, "They're digging a tunnel." The Nightsong Tiger ordered Amandina to retreat a little, and the captain of the mercenaries of Lopez placed his hands on the parapet wall and looked down. Under the cover of the wooden shields raised by the bugbears, the subterrane dwellers were digging rapidly. Their speed was astonishing, and they lived up to their name as the subterrane dwellers. However, there was no kerosene in the sawmill, and even stones were pitifully scarce. The mercenaries tried to throw logs down, but the logs were useless against the bugbears. Fortunately, they had a backup plan. A portion of the mercenaries immediately followed the original plan and retreated to the trenches that they dug in the afternoon. The trenches were specially dug to deal with the subterrane dwellers' tunnels. According to Brando's instructions, each of the trenches was several meters deep. Thus, when the subterrane dwellers dug the first tunnel in half an hour, the ones at the front were immediately pushed to the bottom of the trench by the subterrane dwellers behind. The subterrane dwellers were all dizzy from the fall. They subconsciously looked up to see what was going on, but what awaited them was the spears of the humans. Even though the subterrane dwellers had outstanding individual strength, when faced with more than 10 spears, they could only end up being pierced like hedgehogs. After losing dozens of men, the subterrane dwellers realized that this path was impassable. Thus, they had no choice but to retreat and use a more direct and violent method. The mercenaries on the walls quickly realized that the subterrane dwellers were using the subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers were building a human ladder. It was an effective method, but the only flaw was that they had to abandon the bugbears. The bugbears squatted at the bottom of the human ladder and raised their wooden shields to form a platform for the subterrane dwellers to reach the outer walls of the wooden fort. Net. Amandina raised her eyebrows and immediately shouted when she saw the situation. Cornelius and Rabin, who were by her side, immediately passed down the order. In an instant, the wooden walls outside the lumber mill were filled with the sound of orders. In the next moment, the mercenaries erected a large net made of wooden frames and extended it out of the walls. It was like a giant bat that covered the subterrane dwellers. The net was made of simple oil ropes that were used to form the frame of the net. These ropes and the wooden frames that formed the net were made from local materials and could be found everywhere in the lumber mill. These simple nets might seem laughably crude in a battle between humans, but they were effective against the subterrane dwellers who were not proficient in sieges. While the subterrane dwellers were climbing up the walls and dealing with the nets, the mercenaries were able to take advantage of the high ground and wait for the subterrane dwellers to exhaust themselves. The subterrane dwellers quickly suffered heavy losses. Yuta and the other two could not help but click their tongues in amazement when they saw this scene. It was simple but effective. It was different from the tactics of the regular army. It did not seem like a method that a noble or a knight would come up with, but it was more like an emergency plan that the experienced mercenaries would come up with. However, this was the defensive strategy that the young lord had instructed them to use. It made them feel a little surprised, but they did not know that the players in the game had invented many of these tricks. Relying on the simple nets, the mercenaries repelled the subterranean dwellers several times in a row. However, the battle had unavoidably reached a climax. The large net made of oil ropes was not unbreakable. As more and more subterranean dwellers broke through the net, the battle on the wooden walls finally began to draw blood. For the first time, the humans suffered losses, and the number of casualties was rapidly increasing. In a direct battle, the subterranean dwellers' advantage in single combat was gradually revealed. The mercenaries retreated step by step. As more and more subterranean dwellers surged up the walls, they realized that their previous advantage no longer existed. In fact, many of the defenders were chased away, and the subterranean dwellers from Jorgendi Ridge were about to break through the walls. Even though they were not proficient in sieges, their advantage in numbers made up for their shortcomings. Cornelius and Rabin, who were sweating profusely, looked at Amandina. They knew that the only way to turn the situation around was with this noble girl. Of course, if she did not take action, then they would have to use their own methods to end the battle. The two leaders made the same decision in their hearts at the same time. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 267. In the valley, the battle seemed to have stopped all of a sudden, and it became quiet. The sound of wings flapping in the wind broke the silence, but Tajiv's reaction was quick. In the dark underground of Jorgendi Ridge, there were creatures with the ability to fly, such as harpies and some dragon-like creatures. Among the spells passed down from generation to generation, there were some that were specifically used to deal with the enemy's aerial forces. For example, a large number of anti-flight spells, just like what the subterranean dweller witch doctor was doing. It raised 3 fingers, with its index and middle fingers pointing forward, forming a triangle with its thumb. Tas Dam. Domain of Stagnation. Tajiv accurately read out the 2 runes with its sharp voice. The anti-flight spell used by the witch doctor was a type of rune spell. Legend had it that the 2 runes were once in the hands of the witch Northwind, but they were lost in the land. Since then, the runes had been widely spread and were used by mortal spellcasters. In short, Brando understood that the 2 runes were meant to seize control of the air from the Northwind spell. Depending on the power of the spellcaster, the area of restriction would be different. For a low-level witch doctor like Tajiv, he could not deprive more than 10 units of the ability to fly. Moreover, it was unlikely that he could cast a second spell. Brendel raised his head and saw that the space in front of the goat's head had stagnated. The 2 archangels seemed to have been locked down by some kind of invisible spell. After stopping in their tracks, they fell from the sky dozens of feet away and crashed heavily onto the ground like meteors. He saw a cloud of dust 100 meters away. Ah! Scarlet's eyes reflected the same scene, and she couldn't help but cry out in shock. She was distracted for a moment, and the earth spirit bear in front of her hit her with its flail. Don't be distracted, it's fine over there. Brando supported Scarlet, who was staggering back, and his expression showed that he was not too worried about the angels he summoned. He retracted his gaze from that direction and asked, "How are your injuries?" Scarlet shook her head. The bugbear goblin's attack was merely a beginner's silver-level attack. It was not very effective against a gold-level rank 1. Moreover, she had the physique of an oracle, so her recovery and defense were much better. Brando nodded and helped the red-haired girl to her feet. He frowned as he stared at the approaching row of earth spirit bears. Compared to Tajiv's predicament, his current situation wasn't optimistic either. He looked at the encirclement and ordered in a low voice, "Retreat." "Retreat?" Scarlet was taken aback. It had not been easy for them to carve a bloody path out of the tens of thousands of soldiers to get here. They were less than 100 meters away from the flag of the subterranean dweller leader. If they retreated now, wouldn't all their efforts be in vain? She could not help but look at the two angels suspiciously. Did the Lord trust them that much? After all, their goal was not as simple as killing Tajiv. However, after losing the ability to fly, she found it hard to believe that they could still accomplish their goal. "Sir Lord. Listen to my orders," Brando said in a deep voice. Scarlet was slightly startled, and after hesitating for a moment, she had no choice but to nod. On the other side, just as Brando expected, Tajiv was also in trouble. As a subterranean dweller, it was a tribal leader and had seen many things. However, its knowledge was limited to the underground of Jorgandi Ridge. Just like how it faced the harpies from the dark swamp, there were no other creatures in the underground of Jorgandi Ridge other than the harpies. However, it was proud of the fact that it not only knew about the harpies, but it also knew about the feathered serpents and a legendary large bird on the surface. Giant eagle. The giant eagle of the wind elves. There were records of this creature in the history of Tajiv's ancestors. It was a record of a war on the surface world. Although Tajiv didn't know why his ancestors would come to the surface world like it did, in that oral history, the creature that could fly higher, bigger, and more ferocious than the harpy had left a deep impression on Tajiv. Therefore, when the sound of the wings rang out, it immediately had such a conditioned reflex in its heart. It knew that whether it was the giant eagle, the feathered serpent, the harpies, or the dragon-like creatures in the underground world, they all had one thing in common. Once they lost their ability to fly, they would have a hard time moving on the ground. Tajiv even went one step further. It subconsciously thought that all creatures with the ability to fly would become clumsy once they lost their ability to move. It was just like how a subterranean dweller would still stumble in the air even if it had the ability to fly. This was a simple and easy to understand principle. However, Tajiv did not expect that there would be angels, griffins, and other amphibious creatures in this world, not to mention the dragons, which it had only heard of in legends. This mistake was fatal from the start, and it could not be undone. Tajiv thought that it had missed the best time to withdraw the bugbears from the front lines to protect it. While it was waiting for the two humans to fall into a desperate situation, it soon heard a discordant sound. The two giant eagles that had been shot down actually began to dash towards it at a speed that was beyond its imagination. Tajiv finally realized that it was in danger. However, it only had a few subterranean dwellers and a few subterranean dwellers that it could use. These motley crew were powerless in front of the two silver-ranked angels. As expected, it soon heard the sound of its own personal guards being defeated. Then, it felt two cold blades on its neck. The fact that they could use weapons meant that they were humanoid creatures with intelligence. They were obviously not giant eagles. Tajiv seemed to have understood their intentions, but it raised its head and tried to block their next words with the pride of a tribal leader. "I won't surrender." This was a stuttering crew's language that it had learned from interacting with Groudon's envoys. However, the two angels did not say a word. When Tajiv said those words, the battlefield paused for a moment. The subterranean dweller's hearing was extremely sensitive. Even though it was just a conversation at the center of the battlefield, it was transmitted to almost the entire battlefield. Brando felt the change in the battlefield. He raised his head and saw the giant eagle fall to the ground. However, the subterranean dweller's change did not affect the bugbear's hearing. Scarlet, who was in charge of protecting him, was sweating profusely and kept retreating. Brendel grabbed the girl's collar and pulled her behind him without a word, then swung his sword forward. He carefully controlled his strength so that he would not collapse from exhaustion, and at the same time, he used the wind generated by the sword to force back the large creatures. However, after this sword strike, even he could not help but feel a wave of dizziness. "My lord." Scarlet was shocked when she felt her collar being grabbed, but she did not resist when she realized that it was Brando who did it. Instead, she asked curiously. "We're here." Brando replied. Scarlet turned around and realized that they had returned to the edge of the battlefield. "What do we do now?" she panted and asked doubtfully. Even though she saw the giant eagle fall, it did not mean anything. Even if Tajiv died, the subterranean dwellers on the other side of the forest would continue to attack Amandina. The current situation was different from their original plan. Brando shook his head and pulled Scarlet back as he snapped his fingers. Soon, the two of them saw a flash of silver charging out from the dark forest. It was their silver warhorse. Amandina finally nodded when she saw Cornelius and Rabban looking at her. "Inform the acolytes to prepare their spells." Even though the nearest subterranean dweller was dozens of feet away from her, Amandina calmly stared at the direction of the wooden wall where the mercenaries were engaged in a tug-of-war with the subterranean dwellers. She replied in the same calm tone. "Wait." Yuda's voice came from behind everyone. They turned around and saw her cutting down a subterranean dweller with her sword and killing her way out from the other side. At the start of the battle, Amandina was left behind on the southern wall when she went to check on her subordinates. It took her a lot of effort to kill her way back to them. As soon as she appeared, she called out to the few people present. Almost all of the spellcasters present were from her party, and she was well aware of the important role her people had to play in this battle. However, Jana was afraid that these people did not understand the situation, because not everyone among the mercenaries had the opportunity to use spellcasters on a large scale. Only a few spellcasters know how to use silence. If the others want to form a formation to amplify the effect of the spell, it will consume their own strength. Yuta took a deep breath and said, "What I want to say is that we only have one chance to use silence on such a large scale. I know it's effective, but are you sure you want to use it now? We don't have any other choice." Cornelius answered, "If we give up on the wall, we won't be able to fight this battle. Seize the opportunity to chase them down and buy us more time." Rabban said. Yuta turned around and looked at Amandina. "What happens after that?" she asked seriously. "After that?" Amandina raised her head to look at the stars in the sky. It was already the latter half of the night, and she calmly replied, "There's no more after that. The only thing left for us to do is to wait for the news of our Lord's victory." Amandina's answer left everyone stunned. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 268. They've retreated. Yuta's face was covered in blood as she sat opposite Amandina. She gasped for breath as she looked at Amandina. On the other hand, Amandina's face was only stained with a few drops of blood. Her black eyes were still filled with fear from the previous battle, but she forced herself to calm down. Amandina nodded. The silence spell was not as effective as they had imagined. They thought that it was a panacea, but in the end, they realized that its effects were limited. Because the battle had reached its climax when Roland cast his spells, command and tactics had become secondary factors. The subterranean dwellers were simply charging forward one after another, relying on their momentum to break through the humans' defense line. When the mercenaries discovered this, they almost missed the best opportunity. If it wasn't for Vern leading his men at the most critical moment and using their slight advantage to forcefully sweep the enemy off the wall, the consequences would have been unimaginable. The fiercest wave of attacks had been repelled. The subterranean dwellers who suffered heavy losses finally realized that the casualties were unbearable. They retreated, but the danger from before left a lingering fear in everyone's hearts. The battlefield quieted down, and only the heavy breathing of the mercenaries behind the wooden walls could be heard. No one counted the casualties because it was unnecessary for the time being. Everyone understood that if there was no miracle before the next attack was launched, their chances were slim. They will come again. Rabin sat on the other side, his body aching. He looked up at the moon in the sky and said calmly, "The next attack will be before dawn at the latest. It depends on when the second wave of subterranean dwellers arrives." "What should we do?" Cornelius asked. Everyone was silent. Even Amandina, who was the most resolute, did not dare to say that she was 100% certain after experiencing that moment of life and death. For the first time in her life, she wondered if she would really die here if the Lord didn't come. But when she thought about it, if it was not for Brando, she could have died in Bragg's dark and cold house. Amandina calmed down as she thought about it. "Mercenaries do their best and leave the rest to fate," Vern said with a grin. "We've seen a lot of life and death. As for when they attack again, we will open the door and break out separately. As for whether we live or die, it will depend on whether Lady Martha is willing to take care of all of us here." Cornelius was slightly startled, but a bitter smile appeared on his face. He shook his head and looked back at Amandina. "With this, Miss Amandina, we should be able to answer to your lord, right?" Amandina nodded. "Thank you, everyone." "You don't have to thank me." Yuta interrupted her. "We're just willing to believe that guy this once. But don't worry, even if he doesn't come, I won't leave you two behind." Roman sat across from him. She hugged her knees and stared at him with her dark brown eyes. "Thank you. You're such a good person." Amandina smiled and replied, "But Brando will definitely come. He never brags. If he says he can do it, then he will definitely do it. You believe in him, little girl." Yuta took notice of Amandina for the first time. "Actually," Amandina hesitated, "I'm also willing to believe in Lord Brendel's words. It seems like our Lord Brendel has such charisma to be able to make two beautiful ladies fall head over heels for him." Vern's tanned face showed a hint of a smile as he teased, "If I have such ability, then I can die without regrets." Cornelius snorted in disdain after hearing his words. This handsome silver-haired middle-aged man had always prided himself as a playboy in the mercenary world. He could not help but think that if this unromantic man could also be in such a situation, then all the men in the world should just bang their heads against the wall and die. Amandina lowered her head slightly, using her unique shyness as a noble lady to respond to such vulgar teasing. On the other hand, Roman raised her small eyebrows and waved her hands with a red face. "Wrong, wrong, I don't believe in Brando because of this reason." "Then what is the reason?" Yuta could not help but ask curiously. This time, even Amandina joined the crowd without batting an eyelid. Even though she had followed Brando for a long time, she knew that she was a noble. Long before she met Brando, she and many others had many stories with him. She had tried to find out the stories of this small group, but the most she could find was the story of the copper dragon Reto. In fact, this was not the first time she wanted to know what had happened before Fortress Reden, when Madara first invaded. Her sharp intuition told her that there was more to this story, but it was just like Roman and Brando's background. Everything was a mystery that could not be solved. She only knew that there was another important woman in this group. From Brando's words, she knew that the woman was called Freya, and was currently far away from them. As for who she was and what she was doing, Brando had never told her, and she did not know where to start asking. "You don't understand." Romaine's lips unconsciously curled into a slightly smug and mysterious smile, her eyes sparkling. "When Brando brought me out of Butchie, I saw Brando's eyes, and I knew that Brando had become a true man, because my aunt always told me that a true man is willing to take responsibility for his promises, so the little Roman must find a man who is willing to protect her." The Roman rubbed his hands as he replied slowly. "Just because of that." Yuta was a little puzzled. Vern listened without saying a word. He just matched what the young lord had done to him. Cornelius was the only one who snorted in disdain. "I've never seen a noble who could be considered a man in all the regions I've visited. In fact, I'd give him a thumbs up if any of them had the guts to do so." His words received a lot of agreement from the surrounding mercenaries, but Amandina did not refute him. She only silently remembered the words Roman mentioned about Butchie. She raised her head and was about to say something, but at that moment, a mercenary rushed over from the other side of the wooden wall and interrupted their conversation. The newcomer brought bad news. "Leaders, there seems to be movement in the forest. The scouts said that the subterranean dwellers are preparing to attack again." Everyone was shocked. So fast. The harmonious atmosphere from before disappeared without a trace. The scene was silent as the mercenaries looked at each other. A layer of dark clouds silently shrouded the top of everyone's head. Amandina had told them to wait for news of the young lord's victory, but now the dark clouds seemed to cover the moon, and there was not a trace of hope in the darkness. At this moment, even the noble daughter herself felt a little suffocated. But in the valley, the changes on the battlefield were out of the expectations of the subterranean dwellers. The metal stallion lightly leaped across the battlefield, and Shi Qian was the first to jump down from its back. She landed lightly beside Tajiv and turned around at the same time. Her amber eyes reflected the subterranean dweller that had turned around on the battlefield and was charging towards them. Brando's angels blocked the subterranean dwellers that were charging at the front, and those that dared to get close were stabbed to the ground. Qian frowned and instinctively felt the urgency of the situation. She immediately placed her halberd on the neck of the subterranean dweller who was lying on the ground. "Make them surrender." "I die," Tajiv stuttered in Cruz's language. "You won't live." The cunning of the subterranean dweller was out of her expectations. She froze for a moment, then snorted coldly and pretended to be calm. "Don't think that you're smart. Don't forget that we have the Pegasus." She pressed her halberd closer. "I'll give you one more chance, make them stop attacking." Tajiv hesitated for a moment. Of course, it was afraid of death, but things were not that simple, so it decided to take a gamble. "If that's the case, please arrange for me to meet Lord Xia." Xia was a god in the subterranean dwellers' legends. It was rumored that it was a giant lizard that lived in the elemental plane of Earth. However, the players in Amber Room had already proven that it was just a mythical dragon-like creature, and had nothing to do with the gods. "Don't think that I won't kill you." Qian was furious, and she couldn't help but kick the subterranean dweller. The kick was so heavy that it almost made the subterranean roll on the ground a few times. But this kick confirmed Tajiv's suspicions. It wasn't afraid at all. Instead, it patted the dust off its body and replied calmly, "I think you can run away, but your companions in the forest. I'm afraid that they might not be safe, right?" Qian was stunned. She didn't think that the subterranean dweller would be able to guess what they were thinking. But of course, she couldn't admit it. "Which power do you belong to?" Brando asked. He looked down at the subterranean dweller from his horse. "Toland City or Dragon's Tongue City?" His words immediately had an effect. Tajiv carefully shut its mouth. Even though it didn't have eyes, the subterranean dweller still subconsciously raised its head to look at the young lord. If its expression could be described, it would be an expression of fear towards a poisonous snake. Toland City and Dragon's Tongue City weren't famous in the underworld of Jorgandi Ridge, but they were the archenemies of the subterranean dweller that Tajiv once belonged to. This meant that this young man was familiar with the underworld. Tajiv suddenly realized that its advantage had disappeared, as if a faint sense of superiority had been sucked out of its body. It couldn't help but reevaluate the two humans that it had always looked down on. For the first time, it felt that they were on equal footing. But where did this young man come from? Why did he mention Toland City and Dragon's Tongue City? What did they have to do with the archenemies of its subterranean dweller? But ever since it left the underworld, it had nothing to do with its original subterranean dweller. In the underworld of Georgandy Ridge, it was very common for people to change their allegiance. It couldn't think of any reason why this young man would chase after it. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 269. The more Tajiv thought about it, the more it was in line with Brando's expectations. In fact, Brendel only wanted to scare the subterranean dweller to prevent it from getting too arrogant. Sioux Land and Dragon's Tongue City were near Tonagel's underground passage. Since the subterranean dweller appeared here, Brendel guessed that it must have come from these two places. These things were secrets to the humans on the surface of this era, but to him, it was not a big deal. As far as I know, the subterranean creatures are not welcomed in the human world, Brendel said sternly after dealing a blow to Tajiv's arrogance. I don't want to interfere in your world. Tajiv lowered its tone. It was not lying. Although Tajiv did have an ambitious plan in the beginning, the human's weakness gave it an opportunity to take advantage of it. The subterranean dweller once wanted to expand its territory to Groton's territory, but it gave up on that idea when it heard the news from outside the forest. It gradually understood the unfamiliar world outside, and finally found out that the ancient human kingdom called Erewhon had millions of people. It was simply unimaginable. Even the weak human nobleman outside was called Groton according to the human language. There were hundreds of thousands of people living in the land under his rule. Even so, he was just a nameless little overlord in this land. In Tajiv's mind, only the lords of powerful forces in the dark underworld of Georgandy Ridge could have so many people and slaves. For example, Sioux Land and Dragon's Tongue City, which Brando mentioned. The terrifying number of humans made Tajiv wake up from its shock. It immediately gave up on its original idea, or else it would not have accepted Groton's offer to trade with him. Is that so? Brando did not accept its kindness, but it seems that your words are not consistent with your words. The forest you occupy is the sacred and inseparable land of the humans since ancient times. He said it in a very habitual tone, but he immediately realized that there was a problem and changed his words. No, let me put it another way. These 4 sawmills are part of my entire wealth, and I don't intend to lend them to you for even a minute. Your wealth? Tajiv was surprised. It had seen Groton once or twice, and it did not think that this young man was the legendary Count Ranner. The battle outside had stopped, and the subterranean dwellers were not idiots. They could sense the change in attitude of their leader. Even though Tajiv did not order them to stop attacking, they knew that if they acted rashly, they would lose their leader. The 2 angels were also difficult to deal with. Yes, at least for now, Brando nodded. So, what do you want to do now? The subterranean dweller lowered his head to show the blade on his neck as he stuttered. I'll give you 2 choices, Brendel replied. 1, go back to where you came from. Tajiv shook its head, and the dino-vulture feathers on its body trembled. Was with the subterraneans, unless it was willing to join its original enemy's territory. Tajiv's its... What about the second choice? It asked. You and your subterranean are considered losers in the underworld. Even if you succeed, you will only serve the other dungeon lords. Brando seemed to be absent-minded. If that's the case, why don't you change your mindset and become my subjects? He paused for a moment. I know your rules. If you pledge your loyalty to me, I'll guarantee the continuation of your subterranean. Tajiv was stunned. It could guess what the young man was thinking, but it was also unexpected. Brando actually wanted it to become a subordinate of the subterranean dwellers and dungeon lords. That was equivalent to selling the fate of its entire subterrane to the young man. Of course, this showed that the young man understood the subterranean dwellers well, but it also made it feel ridiculous. What right did he have to ask the subterranean dwellers to pledge their loyalty to him? Tajiv still looked down on humans, but it realized that if it didn't agree, it would be forced to return to the subterranean dwellers to face another choice. This was not something it was willing to accept. It could feel the slight movement of the young man's fingers. Perhaps the young man did not intend to let them return to the subterranean dwellers. If it refused, the blade would immediately fall on its body. It hesitated, and Brando allowed it to hesitate. Scarlet was the only one who did not say a word. She looked at the subterranean dweller that was covered in strange feathers, and then looked at her lord who was riding on his horse. Compared to the two of them, she was more worried. She was worried that if the subterranean dwellers refused, then what would her lord do? She knew better than anyone else that if Tajiv refused, Brando would not be able to stop the subterranean dwellers from attacking Amandina and the others. Even if they killed it, it would not be of any use. She did not think that Amandina and the mercenaries could last until dawn. Moreover, Brando said that they could last until dawn at most. Scarlet could not help but take a deep breath. She became a little nervous. Brando's hand did not move from the hilt of his sword. He did not loosen his grip at all. In fact, Tajiv's guess was not wrong. If it refused, then what awaited it was an unimaginable fate. He did not have as many worries as Scarlet because he had already planned this from the start. He had already prepared 100 wealth points in his treasury. If Tajiv refused, then it would be sealed as a card. Even though it was different in nature, the tribe would still submit to him in the end. Brando knew that he needed this strength. With these subterranean dwellers as his surprise troops, Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus would no longer be important. With 3,000 iron-ranked warriors, Tonajol would soon be left with only one voice. This was a story that Count Randner would never be able to predict. But before that, the only variable was the answer that the subterranean dweller was about to give. Brando waited patiently for it to speak, but he was also feeling uneasy. Just like on this night, on this battlefield, at this moment, Brando seemed to see a path that extended forward in the darkness. The thorny path became so clear for the first time since he came to this world. It was the first time he felt that he had the ability to change the future and destiny. There's still a little bit left. The subterranean dweller finally raised its trembling head. Its dino-vulture feathers quivered as if it had just made up its mind. Tajiv opened its mouth and said, "Let's go." At that moment, the cool night breeze blew across the battlefield. The pine trees rustled, drowning out the words that could change the fate of Tonajol, and even the whole of Erewhon. The young man's expression softened. He nodded. "As long as you're sure." Then he added, "Because in fact, you will find that you have gained far more than you have lost." As the days passed, the city of Abes that had lost its lord after the chaos gradually calmed down. The market gradually regained its former peace. But in reality, more things had happened under the calm surface. For example, the mercenaries who participated in the battle for the lumber mill. No one could say for sure how they won that night. Especially the battle that was originally planned to take a week or more to end, but after dawn, it ushered in a dramatic turn of events. The subterranean dwellers not only retreated when they had the absolute advantage in terms of numbers and situation, but they also withdrew from the sawmill that they occupied and handed over their own territory to the subterranean dwellers. The only thing that changed about such a miraculous outcome was the impression that all the mercenaries had of the subterranean dwellers. After this battle, Brando became a mysterious and omnipotent figure in the hearts of the mercenaries. As for the other leaders, although they had their own doubts, they all expressed their unconditional allegiance to Brendel. But Brendel did not immediately split them up and reorganize them. On the contrary, he had more things to do right now. First was the lumber mill in the forest. After the residents of the Green Village moved in, the lumber mill had begun to provide ABs with a steady flow of wood. The restoration of the city walls had been put on the agenda. Another matter was to restore the life of the barren land of ABs. For example, when he returned to ABs, he made Amandina exempt from all taxes for 3 years. This news sounded unbelievable from the start. After all, it was natural for a lord to rely on taxes to support his army. However, Brando did not care about that little bit of profit. Only he knew what he wanted to do. It was not a problem for him to leisurely be a rich lord, but it was like a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood for the greater scheme. Rather than that, it was better to use it to pacify the people. Brando was aware of the hidden undercurrents in his territory. Before the battle with Grodin's 2 retainers, he was afraid that every citizen here would doubt how long he could stay here. He could not help but smile at the thought of it. He lifted his head from his desk. The desk was naturally Grodin's property, but the former lord spent a lot of time on it every month to deal with Tanagel's affairs. Perhaps only the heavens would know. At this moment, Brando heard a commotion outside the window. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 270. The weather was slightly brighter in the morning, but the air was still chilly from the previous night. When the horses and men breathed, their mouths and noses were covered in a layer of frost. At this time of the year, one could already feel the presence of winter in Tanagel. The group of men and horses passed through a valley between 2 mountains. The forest around them was a cold black, as if it was an ink painting. Further away, the mountains behind the clouds were verdant. There were more than 30 people in the group, all of them fully armored and armed. They were all soldiers who had been released from their jobs, but they were not Erwin's professional soldiers. They were mercenaries. In Tanagel, professional soldiers could only be seen near the Paulus region. Grodin's most elite knight were gathered at the Greyhar mountain pass, which extended to the north. After passing through the valley, the small group of men and horses entered a small clearing surrounded by forests. There was another group of men there, and they were currently escorting a few young men who were sitting on the ground with their heads hung low. When the young men heard the noise, they raised their heads and saw the stern face of the middle-aged noble leading the group. Most of their faces were filled with fear and trepidation. Only the young man in the middle of the group remained calm, though he was a little annoyed. The middle-aged noble was riding on his favorite horse, Black Fox. It was tall and had a black mane as smooth as silk. It was one of the purest horses from the north. When he was young, this horse had accompanied him through life and death. Even though it was no longer as brave as it used to be, Lord Maxon still had a deep affection for it. He lowered his head and looked at the young men without saying a word. This man was Lord Maxon, and these men were his men. Lord Maxon had received news of the rebellion in Baron Ab's territory a few days ago, but he did not immediately take action. In Erwin, if a retainer led an army into the Lord's territory without the Lord's orders, it was considered a rebellion. Lord Maxon only ordered his knight to set out after confirming that the news was reliable. The Menta region bordered the barony of Ferber, and the army left in the morning and arrived in the evening. He gathered his men overnight, and by the next morning, they had already left the hilly region of Menta and entered the flat valley along the Gus River. Gillis Ferry was right in front of them. Earlier, the scouts had reported that the ferry was not occupied by the rioters. Many people in the town did not even know what had happened in Abs. On the other hand, the cavalry had already gone 10 miles into the coastal area, but they still didn't find any traces of the rioters. Lord Maxon wasn't too surprised. From the information he'd received, the ones involved in the riot in Abes were just a few mercenaries. These people were lawless to begin with, and could do anything. These fellows, who were no different from bandits in his eyes, had most likely dispersed after a round of looting. As for further control of the ferry, they wouldn't do it unless they wanted to take over Abes territory. Lord Maxon felt that he was overthinking things. The rioters were just a bunch of mercenaries who were obsessed with money. They wouldn't wait to be exterminated. He was originally worried that Madara was behind this since the undead army was still entrenched in the south. But now, the situation was clear. This was just a riot. This was a relief to Sermente. However, his good mood didn't last long. A piece of news that annoyed him reached his ears through the mouths of his trusted aides. This was also the reason why he had brought more than 30 men with him to this forest. The young man in the middle of the crowd, clad in a light brown coat, with a sword at his hip, and sitting cross-legged on the ground, looking at him, resembling the knight himself, was one of his youngest sons. This youngest son was his favorite out of his 3 sons. He was quick-witted and showed signs of talent from a young age. Lord Maxon had invested a lot of effort into him, but the latter didn't appreciate it. In his early years, he idled around and didn't want to do anything serious. Later on, he was sent to Brother Mahala's territory to train in the hope that he would restrain his personality. But not only did his wish not come true, he even had some strange ideas after gaining some experience outside. The trusted aide had told him the whole story. When the rioters caught up to them, the young master planned to run away with his servants and attendants. Lord Maxon didn't know the exact reason, but when he saw the young men on the ground, he couldn't help but feel angry. "Speak," he asked from his horse, looking down at the young man, "what's the situation?" The young man sitting on the ground didn't seem to care about his prestige and raised his chin. "It's too boring, father." "Humph," Lord Maxon said in a low voice, "didn't you want to experience war? I'll let you experience it once. But what's the situation now? You better explain it to me." "War? It's just a bunch of rioters. What kind of war is this?" The young man smiled and said with disdain. But then he raised his head and said seriously, "Father, did you know? It's rumored that Princess Griffine has returned to her territory and is gathering her knight." Lord Maxon was stunned. Even though he was a noble, his status was pitifully small. He had heard of the rumors in the north, but that was a banquet for important people. It had nothing to do with someone like him who couldn't even be considered a chess piece. "What does that have to do with you?" he asked. "Of course it does," the young man said excitedly. "The next battle will decide the fate of this country. I've already decided to throw myself into this magnificent history and follow Her Highness." Lord Maxon didn't expect his son to have such thoughts. He paused for a moment before saying, "You're dreaming. You've never left your home before, so how do you know where Her Highness is? What's the situation outside?" "I have my ways," the young man said confidently. Lord Maxon was helpless. He knew that the young man was smart since he was young, and he might be able to find a way. But he shook his head and said, "I don't care if you have a way or not, but you better think of a way to convince me first." "Father," the young man quickly stood up and said, "you can't keep me here either. Why don't you let me go out and make a name for myself? Staying in Tonajul and guarding the family's property for the rest of my life is the responsibility of your generation. As for me, a true knight should be able to make contributions in war." "War? Have you ever seen a war?" Lord Maxon couldn't help but mock. When he was young, he was also a knight who followed Grodin. Even though he hadn't personally fought in a war for many years, he still retained his vigilance even after many years. He didn't care about the war that the young man kept talking about as if it had a romantic tint to it. But he suddenly stopped talking. When he was training with Brother Mahalu, his youngest son had followed Lord Paulus to learn the art of war. Lord Paulus wasn't famous in Erewhon, but he could be considered a first-rate veteran in Tonagel. Lord Paulus commanded Grodin's most elite knights in the fortress at the northern edge of Mount Garahar. On one hand, they had to guard against attacks from other nobles, and on the other, they had to fight against the natives of the southern border of Tonagel. Compared to the professional bandits, the bandits in Tonagel were as docile as lambs. That was why Lord Paulus was the first person who appeared in everyone's mind. Lord Maxon remembered that his son had also participated in the war between the natives and the natives. His son's experience in battle wasn't much less than his own. He shook his head and said, "All right, I'll give you a chance to convince me." "What chance?" The young man's interest was piqued. "Be my assistant and let me see your performance. If you can do this job well, I'll naturally let you go." Lord Maxon obviously didn't have such intentions. It was just a stalling tactic. He didn't have time to tangle with the young man now, and he would have time to slowly deal with him after this war. "Since this young man likes to fight, I'll just throw him into the hands of that fellow." Lord Maxon naturally thought of Lord Paulus. Even though it was rumored that Grodin's two most capable knights didn't have a good relationship with each other, Lord Maxon actually had a good personal relationship with them. However, the young man understood his father's thoughts. He rolled his blue eyes and smiled. "Father, they're just a bunch of rioters. Don't you think you're making a mountain out of a molehill by doing this?" "Humph, didn't you learn the art of war from Jormat for a long time?" Lord Maxon suddenly realized that this was a good idea. He wanted to find something to let the young man waste his excess energy. He thought of a piece of unreliable news he received recently and decided to add fuel to the fire. "I heard that there's a young leader among the rioters. He's about the same age as you, but he's already a general of an army. On the other hand, you're always bragging about yourself, but you don't seem to have any amazing achievements. Now that I'm giving you this chance, don't you want to give it a try?" Lord Maxon received news that there was indeed a young leader among the rioters, but he didn't know how old he was or what kind of abilities he had. He didn't care who was the leader of the rioters. After all, they were just a bunch of rioters. He only said that to stall for time. "Goading him won't work on a night, father," the young man said, but the look of interest on his face betrayed him. "But all right." In the end, he nodded. "I agree. I'll go and see who this person is." Lord Maxon's face was expressionless, but he was laughing in his heart. "The older, the wiser. No matter how smart you are, you'll still be played by me in the end." "In the end," he sighed. "Young man, you're too impulsive." Author's note, sigh, all my stats, including my collection, are dropping every day. I feel like I've been dealt a blow. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidien.com, support the author, support the legal reading. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidien.com, support the author, support the legal reading. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidien.com, support the author, support the legal reading. Chapter 271. Lord Maxon naturally had to return to the army to command his subordinates after dealing with the sudden situation on his side with much difficulty. However, it was only at this moment that he could not help but rejoice. Thankfully, he was fighting against a bunch of mobs. If it was really a battle between two armies, he really could not spare the time to restrain his lawless son. But different people had different thoughts. The moment Lord Maxon turned around, the young man's subordinates surrounded him. Noticing that the patriarch's thunderous fury did not fall on their heads, they could not help but let out a sigh of relief. However, with a curiosity unique to youths of their age, they asked softly, "Young master, are we going to war?" The young man nodded and smiled nonchalantly. "Of course we're going to war. They're just a bunch of rioters. How can they be more powerful than the natives? Remember, our future enemies may be the true elites of this kingdom. As for these rioters, let them be the first stepping stones on our path forward, but from what my lord said, they seem to be very powerful. Don't worry, even the most outstanding commoners have limited knowledge." The young man snorted. "Besides, I still don't know my father's intentions. He's just stalling for time. Does he think I can't see through it? Even if he says they're powerful, they might not be powerful. But it doesn't matter. Let's see what else he can say after I've shut him up." He looked at Lord Maxon's disappearing figure and couldn't help but smile slyly. The light in the room became brighter. But the argument outside the window grew louder and louder. Brando furrowed his brows and stood up. He walked around the walnut desk and came to the window to see what was going on in the courtyard. Through the white window, he saw Bosley, Amandina, and his 3 subordinates arguing about something. The silver elf princess stood at the side and seemed to be mediating. On the other side, Scarlet leaned on her halberd under a black pine tree. She bit on a blade of grass as she looked over, seemingly uninterested in what was going on. What's going on? Brando did not understand why these people were arguing, but after hesitating for a moment, he decided to go down and see what was going on. After all, it was not a good thing for his own corps members to quarrel. But just as he opened the door, a black shadow crashed into him. If not for Brando's quick reaction, the two of them would have collided. He took a step back and saw that it was Falerne. She also took a step back. "My lord." She sorted out her emotions and handed over a piece of paper. "What's the matter?" Brando was surprised. "What day is it today? Things are happening one after another." He took the paper and closed the door as he walked out. He lowered his head and looked at the paper in surprise. "Samuel's troops have already passed Grief Ferry." The Samuel he spoke of course was Lord Maxon. Long before the battle with the subterranean dwellers, the mercenaries had already spread out along the banks of Gree River. After taking back the sawmill, Brando, who withdrew his hand, had his eyes and ears spread out between Abies and Grief Ferry. That was why the moment Lord Maxon crossed Gree River, the news had already reached him. Falerne followed behind him and nodded, "Yes, my lord." "Then shouldn't they have mobilized since yesterday? This is much earlier than the Shire expected. This guy isn't simple." Brando couldn't help but sigh. Of all the reliable people around him, the one who was most familiar with the nobles of Aween and the art of war was none other than Seal. According to the young wizard's judgment, Lord Maxon would not move too early. The rules of the game between the nobles of Aween were set in stone, and normal people would not be able to overstep them. Of course, Brando was an outsider who didn't know anything about the game. If it can't be early, then it can only be late. Judging from the indecisiveness and cowardice of the nobles in Aween, Seal had set Menta's troops to be deployed 2 days later. But now, it seems that this knight's ability is above the average of the lower nobles in Aween. "How many people are there?" Brando asked. "A few hundred, but not more than 1,000. Falerne replied expressionlessly, but Cornelius's scouts didn't dare to go too deep into Gree River. "I don't know if there are any follow-up." "Don't worry, there aren't any," Brando shook his head. "Samuel is just a retainer. How many people can he have?" "It's just a few hundred." He couldn't help but smile bitterly. "They look down on us. Compared to my lord's strange way of thinking, I'd rather everyone look down on us." Falerne looked at him and took the initiative to speak. Brando smiled and let go of the topic, but he suddenly remembered something. "By the way," he asked, "I thought I mentioned that there were several fords on the forested side of the river from the crossing of the Giles to the Greyhill Hill, east of here. It's a little troublesome to cross the river, but Cornelius's scouts shouldn't have any problems crossing the river, right? Yes, but who would want to die? That's why mercenaries are inferior to professional soldiers. Brando shook his head. Of course, I'm not talking about you. The mercenaries of Lopez are about the same. Falern replied. Even though mercenaries were known to make a living in war, they didn't follow orders like real soldiers. In fact, they saw war as a business, and would only do as much as the buyer paid them. Most mercenaries were used for a single mission in a war, and their employers were well aware of this fact. Most of them used mercenaries to make up for a temporary lack of military strength. Other than Grodin, who was a local tyrant, very few people would use them as their main force, even if most of them had outstanding personal qualities and experience. In a real war, discipline was often the most important thing. This was the reason why Brando did not reorganize the mercenaries. It was difficult to change the undisciplined nature of the veterans, so he planned to put all of them into the Amber Sword Mercenary Band, and let them perform their duties in future wars. In this era, using mercenaries was a common thing. As for his army, it would be recruited from the locals, and then he would take in a few outstanding talents from the mercenaries. To put it bluntly, he did not intend to use the mercenaries, but he only had the outline of his own army in his mind, and it was only the beginning of the blueprint that he had laid out. In his opinion, there were a lot of things to do. Brando did not receive any news from the north, but the kind knight must have received the news and started to gather his troops. With his loyalty to Grodin, the knight would definitely move his troops to them as soon as possible. However, Brando was not worried when he thought about the elite knights under Lord Paulus' command. Instead, he felt that it was a pity. They were the most professional soldiers in Tonajol, and they had been learning the art of war since young. If only they could be of use to him. Of course, he knew that it was just wishful thinking. Brando crumpled the paper into a ball and put it in his pouch. He had already let go of this matter. He knew that military matters could only be done one step at a time, just like how rice could only be eaten one bite at a time. However, he was not surprised by Lord Maxon's decision to send out his troops. The battle against the subterranean dwellers was not without a purpose. Tajiv and his tribesmen had already sealed off the area from the river to Abes. As for Lord Maxon's fate, Brando did not need to spend too much effort to think about it. A few hundred private soldiers, a few knights, and perhaps a few mercenaries, against 1,000 subterranean dwellers, the outcome was obvious. What's going on down there? Brendel asked after putting the matter aside. Falern shook her head. I don't know. She saw the quarreling party when she passed by the courtyard, but she didn't pay much attention to it due to the cold indifference of a young lady. Brando nodded and did not ask any more questions. The two of them passed through the dark spiral staircase and arrived at the main hall on the first floor. Compared to a few days ago when Brando flipped out here, this place had been refurbished. Even the long table had been changed. The sounds of arguing in the courtyard became clearer. However, the first thing Brando saw was the Roman sitting at the other end of the long table. Her entire body was leaning on the table. She wore a pair of strange spectacles, and her small arms were pressed against a large pile of parchment as if she was copying something. As for the argument outside the courtyard, she turned a deaf ear to it. Of course, when the Roman heard the noise behind her, she suddenly turned around. When she saw the young man, her small face immediately bloomed into a smile. She raised her head and called out in a crisp voice, "Brando." Brando shook his head and walked over to take off the spectacles on the girl's thin nose. He asked in an annoyed tone, "What are you doing with that look on your face?" "Settling accounts." The merchant girl raised her small chin and answered as if it was a matter of course. Brando nodded in understanding. Ever since he took over Abes, all of Grodin's private property had been taken over as spoils of war. Apart from the rewards given to the mercenaries after the war, there was also a large sum of money left behind. P.S. I'm about to vomit blood. I just uploaded it and I lost another favorite. I don't even dare to look at the subscriptions anymore. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 272. However, the management of Grodin's wealth was rather messy. On one hand, Brando had given Amandina, who was now his assistant, the absolute right to manage the wealth. On the other hand, he promised the Roman that she could use the wealth to complete the redevelopment of Tonajul's economy. Later on, even Ciar, the three commanders, and Master Smith Bosley were given limited access to the resources they needed. They didn't have to go through anyone else when they needed the resources. Brando's original arrangement was purely for convenience. Even though he was a great commander in the game for a period of time, it was done with the help of the game system. The game would systematically record the situation of the guild's deposits and withdrawals, and even set up a simple budget. However, he did not have such a helper here. In fact, he only realized that he did not have much experience in managing a territory. Soon, he found that his finances were in a mess. Many things overlapped, and it led to a considerable amount of conflict. In the end, the Roman personally went to Amandina and suggested that one person be in charge of managing the finances, while the other was in charge of keeping records. Only then was the management system stabilized. Brendel's financial system was starting to take shape for the first time. He glanced at the accounts. Of course, to a large extent, he did not understand. Roman had her own way of keeping records. According to her, this method was taught to her by her aunt. According to the Shire, the symbols were probably a code between the witches. However, Brando did not mind. If there were anyone he could rely on, it would be Roman and Freya. After a brief glance, he raised his head again to look outside. The sounds of quarreling could be heard from outside, and it had been going on for quite some time. Yutta's voice was the loudest, Cornelius was supporting her from the side, and Bosley was only occasionally interrupting. Amandina spoke the least. Medisha, who was trying to mediate the argument, was on the verge of losing her voice. However, it seemed that no one could convince the other. "What are they arguing about?" he asked. The young Roman immediately shook his head happily, imitating Amandina's tone. "Only the master of the house knows the price of food, my lord." Brando was stunned. He had already vaguely guessed the core of the dispute outside. The dispute in the courtyard had been going on for quite some time. Amandina furrowed her brows as she looked at the people in front of her. Even though she maintained basic courtesy on the surface, she was actually annoyed to death. Of course, she would support the Lord's decision to establish his own army. She also knew that Brendel had given Janna, Rabin, the Nightsong Tiger, and Cornelius a mission. He wanted them to pick a few people from the citizens of Ferber and prepare to set up the framework for his future private army. But that was not the problem. Abes had a population of nearly 15,000. The autumn harvest was over, and the grain reserves in the city were tight. It was just enough to last them until the next month of thunder. In other words, the extra mercenaries' rations could not be guaranteed. They had to rely on trade. On the other hand, Tonajul was going to face a large number of battles. During wartime, the soldiers' rations would be doubled. Not to mention that they had to reserve food for the next spring. The men and women who worked in the fields needed a large amount of food. When all these food shortages were added together, it was quite a big problem. The subterranean dwellers in the forest also needed food. Grodin did not care about how many people starved to death in his territory, but the subterranean dwellers could not. Moreover, if he wanted to further control Ab's territory, the food shortage would be even more inconceivable. Amandina now knew that in the year of blooming flowers and summer leaves, the crops in the south of Aween were generally failing. One reason was because of the weather, and the other was because of Madara's invasion. Thus, they had to face another problem if they wanted to purchase food. This was because everyone knew that the war in the south had just ended, and the war in the north was about to break out. Erewhon's sky could be said to be filled with dark clouds. The consequences of the war was that the price of food would become more stable than precious metals. In other words, the price of food would rise, and it would not be just a little. As Erewhon's largest free trade port, the merchants of Ampere Seal would not be unaware of the current situation. These unscrupulous merchants would not slow down even a little bit out of pity. They would only take the opportunity to drive up prices. Thus, the future of purchasing food was bleak. Amandina had rubbed her forehead many times because of this, but she still could not come up with a good solution. She had considered the silver mines in Schaflund, but as an assistant, she could only make suggestions when it came to military matters. If Brando rejected this suggestion, then she could only consider the problem from the perspective of the resources in her hands. Furthermore, she knew that Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus's army was right in front of her, and her lord would not be able to free himself for a while. In fact, even the Roman lady who always did things her own way had obediently delayed her own plans. But at this time, Yida came to her to arrange for the recruitment of a private army. First of all, recruiting soldiers required money, especially at this time of the year. Secondly, the soldiers would also need rations, and if they had to train, then the shortage of rations would be even greater. Amandina could not imagine the consequences of that. It took her a lot of effort to convince the female mercenary commander to delay the recruitment of a private army until the people in the territory settled down. Just then, Grandmaster Blacksmith Bosley arrived, and asked for money. Brando originally wanted him to build a workshop as soon as possible, but whether or not the workshop was to make enchanted armor, it would first require a lot of manpower and resources. Not to mention that Tonajul did not produce iron, even the training of blacksmiths required a lot of money. Bosley, as a master blacksmith, did not need to worry about material things, so when he lacked these things, the first thought that came to his mind was, of course, he wanted it. Cornelius had yet to calm down, but Cornelius had appeared out of nowhere. Of course, he wanted money as well. However, he did not come for the recruitment of soldiers, but for the funds of the mercenaries. Everyone knew that there would be losses in war. At this moment, the mercenary groups under the mercenary leaders in Ferber City could be said to be under the tree that was Brendel. They were mercenaries in name, but in reality, they were a different kind of private army. Without a regular source of income, the task of replenishing their equipment fell on Brando's shoulders. Originally, Brando wanted to maintain a special relationship with the mercenaries, but since they were all in the same boat, and Cornelius knew that the mercenaries were lacking in money, he did not mention the matter of hiring them. However, the mercenaries were about to start a war, and the matter of replenishing their equipment could not be delayed, so he had no choice but to come. In order to replenish their equipment, including armor, arrows, and weapons, there was only one thing that needed to be mentioned: money. Amandina was at a loss for words. She did not have enough money on hand. But before she could think of a suitable solution, a few people started to quarrel over a few words. For a time, lines like, "Your business needs to be put aside, my business is more important," were flying everywhere. Amandina was able to mediate at first, but as time went on, she could not help but join in the fight in a fit of anger. In the end, it was Medisha who ran over in a panic to mediate the situation. Only the red-haired girl who came with the silver elf princess didn't care. She simply watched from afar as these people bickered with each other, feeling bored. The quarrel between the mercenaries had reached its climax. Jana had just finished listening to Bosley's sarcastic remarks. As a member of the royal faction, Bosley was a master craftsman who had been through a lot. Naturally, his verbal skills were quite good, and he had mastered the essence of sarcasm. Janna was so angry that she wanted to retort. But just as she was about to open her mouth, her expression changed and she held her tongue. "My lord." The others were stunned for a moment before they turned their heads around. "My lord." Brando looked at them with an unperturbed expression and snorted, "It's quite lively here, isn't it?" Everyone lowered their heads. Only Bosley, who was not part of the group, had a nonchalant expression. "My lord, according to what you've said, we should have a common goal and enemy. Naturally, I'm not here to cause trouble for you. But as we all know, war is a competition of financial resources. From the looks of it, your situation doesn't look too good." "That's right, I'm afraid you're not in a good spot." Brando did not say a word after hearing Bosley's words. He naturally understood this point. Groudon's wealth might seem huge, but that was only for a commoner. It was not enough for the construction of the entire territory. For example, the construction of the city walls cost 1,000 gold a day. In fact, in order to give the workers the confidence to work for him, Amandina had no choice but to double the price. This sounded a little ridiculous, because in this era, a true lord could use the labor of his citizens for free. Before the battle with Count Randner, I'm afraid every citizen here is doubting how long I can stay here. But I'm afraid that I'm not the rightful lord, and I'm afraid that I won't be able to stay here for long. In order to appease the citizens, he had no choice but to use this emergency method to get through the difficult early days. Cornelius and Rabin also suggested that he use forced recruitment to obtain labor, but this suggestion was met with unanimous opposition from Jutta and Amandina. Moreover, the acting finance minister, Roman, also disagreed with this plan. However, she was not against it for moral reasons, but for economic reasons. In the long run, ruining the territory's reputation was not beneficial to the development of the territory, especially the territory's commerce. After all, Brando did not want to lower himself to Groudon's level. But the problem was not just a problem. There had to be a way to solve it. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 273. Lord Maxon's army has arrived at Gar's Ferry. Brendel was silent for a moment, but when he opened his mouth, it was this sentence. Everyone present was stunned, unable to react for a moment. Brando did not avoid Bosley's question, but the latter bowed slightly. "Since this has nothing to do with me, I'll take my leave, my lord." He followed the etiquette of Aween's nobles and placed his hand on his left chest as a sign of respect. He raised his head and reminded Brendel, "That may be the case, but my lord, I await your good news." With that, the old man walked out of the courtyard. "What's going on?" When Janice saw the detestable old man leave, she turned around and asked, "Why didn't we receive any news?" "The news was sent directly to the Nightsong Tiger," Brando replied and introduced the wild elf girl beside him. "This is Falerne, you all know her. Let her speak." Everyone's gaze fell upon the elven girl. Falerne's expression did not change. She raised her chin slightly and recited the current situation unhurriedly. When they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men crossing the river, and that there were only a few knights in the group, and that some of the soldiers were mercenaries, but most of them were peasants who had yet to leave their jobs. Everyone's expression turned strange when they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men crossing the river. "Wait, that bastard, there's no need for him to rush to his death." Jutta brushed her long red hair behind her neck and shook her head in confusion. "He only brought so few men. We can take them all down in one go." "Could it be a decoy?" Cornelius asked in a serious tone. "No, I think Lord Maxon didn't expect us to be so daring." Brando analyzed. "Groudon's most loyal knight's men were killed in the battle with us in the inner city. The rest of his soldiers are just mercenaries and adventurers. After these people dispersed, do you think they would escape and report the news? Everyone was silent. After all, abandoning one's master and running away was not a glorious act. Especially in this era, it was very likely that one would face the danger of being hanged. Naturally, no one would run away to do such a thing that did not have any benefits. Brando continued, so the information Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus might have come from other sources. For example, they might have heard bits and pieces of information from the refugees of Abes or even the barony. After that night, in order to prevent more people from escaping, we had already given the order to seal off the surroundings of Abes. When Amandina heard this, she continued, have your men set up layers upon layers of sentries within 10 miles of the city. As for whether Lord Maxon's spies will be able to sneak in, you know best. Jutta and Cornelius looked at each other. It was not that they were confident, but their subordinates were the most experienced mercenaries. These people weren't necessarily the best soldiers, but they were definitely the best hunters. With their rich experience, they believed that a small noble like Lord Maxon wouldn't be able to sneak his way into the city, let alone obtain accurate information. However, if they dared to blindly send out their troops based on such limited information, it was enough to show the blind arrogance of the nobles. It seemed like they did not put the commoners in their eyes at all. Brando raised his head and immediately saw Jutta and Cornelius straightening their backs. He was stunned for a moment, and could not help but feel a wave of surprise in his heart. After subduing Tajiv and its subordinates, the mercenaries had begun to realize that their status in this group was no longer what it used to be. On the other hand, the mercenaries had no choice but to rely on Brando in the face of Count Randner's revenge. So when Brendel showed enough strength, they put away their unnecessary thoughts and thought more about what kind of position they could obtain in this group in the future. Even someone like Jutta, who was not passionate about fighting for power, had to think for her subordinates. Brando smiled. There must be another reason for this. When they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men under his command, and that there were thousands of subterranean dwellers hiding in the forest, it meant that they had already obtained the merit. Naturally, everyone was willing to fight for it. He first looked at Jutta, then at Cornelius. In fact, Vern and his men were still at the front line, and the former Karsuk cavalry captain was the first of the 3 regimental commanders to submit to him. Before the battle at the sawmill, Vern had secretly talked to him and promised to let him command all his men. But Brendel knew that trusting one person too much would make the 2 commanders suspicious. He thought for a moment and said, "Yes, sir." He thought for a moment and said, "Mr. Cornelius, make your preparations to support Rabin. Find a way to bypass the main battlefield and cut off Lord Maxon's escape route. Capture as many captives as you can. It would be best if you can capture Samuel himself, but don't kill him. I still have some use for him." He paused for a moment. "Of course, you have to judge the situation yourself. Accept my orders." The silver-haired middle-aged man's eyes lit up, and his entire body seemed lighter. He looked at Jutta, who was beside him, and replied in a low voice, "As you wish, my lord." After saying that, Cornelius straightened his sword like a true knight and bowed before leaving the courtyard. Only the sound of his footsteps could be heard as he walked back to the courtyard with a satisfied thump thump thump. Only Jutta was left in the courtyard. She could not help but frown, but she did not say anything in the end. Medisha sighed in relief when she saw that the people who were arguing had left. She bowed slightly to Brando with the elven etiquette, "My lord." Brando nodded and looked at her. The noble lady on the side was obviously relieved. The few fellows who came to ask for money were all sent away by the lord with just a few words. This made her feel as if a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. But it was just a misconception. She did not feel relieved at all because the problem would not be solved by itself. Dragging it out was not a solution. "My lord, are we not going to the front lines?" She thought for a moment and asked while hugging the documents. What's there to see? Brando shook his head. He did not see any suspense in this battle. Moreover, the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius were veterans, and it was much more effective than him going up alone. He knew that he was more suited to lead people into traps. That was his old profession, and he did not want to be a commander. Brando felt that being a lord was enough of a headache for him. As for other things, he would be lazy if he could. If he had the time, it would be better to solve more pressing problems. He turned around and asked, "How much money do we have?" "About 3.5 million Tor coins, and that's after taking into account Grodin's collection and the precious metals in his treasury." Amandina paused for a moment before she quickly replied, "But considering the time, it's not worth that much. In fact, we only have less than a third of this amount in cash." "And my lord," Amandina said with a serious tone, "the problem of food is urgent. As far as I know, Tonagel's annual output is only equal to its consumption. In other words, we do not have a single extra person, and we have to think of a way to feed them." As if she was afraid that Brando did not expect this, she reminded him, "Mr. Reto is leading thousands of refugees in Port Gris." Brando did not forget this point and nodded. Amandina continued, "Speaking of food, it is not a simple matter. First, we do not have a ship. There should be a ship in Port Gris, right?" Medisha reminded in a low voice. Even though she was not familiar with the human world, she had recently studied Tonagel's geography in order to prepare for the war in the future. "Let's not talk about the fact that we don't have full control over Port Gris, and it's just a fishing port." Amandina shook her head. "There might be some merchant ships docked there, but if we want to rent them, it'll cost us a lot of money. Secondly, we cannot use all the money in our hands on one thing, and that is to delay everything that can be delayed. But at least half of it will be used for the upcoming war. To be honest, I do not know how long this situation will last, and Count Rantner will definitely not let us have an easy time." Amandina sighed as she spoke, "Not to mention that even though we control Abes in name, most of the barony of Abes is not under our control. We can say that we are in a difficult situation right now." Amandina hugged the documents in her hands. "Compared to this, I would rather hide in the dark forest. Even the cleverest housewife cannot cook without rice, my lord." She looked at Brando with a resentful gaze. "As for the Magitech laboratory that you promised me, Amandina has nothing to do with it, and it can be delayed. But Grandmaster Bosley looks like he can't wait any longer." Brando could not help but smile bitterly. He knew that Amandina did not mean that she had nothing to do with it, but that she had nothing to do with it for the time being. He also knew that Amandina was telling the truth. The autumn harvest in Tonagel was over, and the only way to solve the problem of food was through trade. But at the end of the day, they still lacked money. Therefore, the first thing he had to figure out was how to make money. He did have a sum of money in Brags, which was left behind by the Romans' first business deal. Before they left, they entrusted this sum of money to Reto's daughter, Sue, to manage. If there were no problems, this sum of money would be at least a few 100,000 Tor coins. But with Count Randner's territory between Trentheim and Grenoires, I can't count on this money. I have to think of another way to solve this problem. The first thing he thought of was naturally Shaftren's silver mine. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 274. Shaflun's silver mine came from the rich silver reserves under Mount Greyhar. This mine extended from the Kalanga Mountains to Tonagel. It was only a small part of the Black Forest, but it was enough to benefit Erowin greatly. In fact, the real silver mine was in Tobadlan Castle, east of Mount Greyhar, on the southern shore of Green Lake. As for Shaflun's silver mine, it was only at the end of this vein. Tonagel's backwater was not just for show. Amandina, tell me about Shaflun's situation. Brando asked. Amandina's eyes lit up. My lord wants to make a move on the silver mine. She immediately replied, My lord, Shaflund has always been one of the most important sources of income in Tonajol. During the year of the cave beasts, the previous lord built a fort here to mine and transport silver. But after that, the town of Shaflund slowly became what it is today. The year of the cave beasts. Brando calculated in his mind, that was almost 30 years ago. Amandina nodded. Currently, the highest authority in this town is an adjutant and a clerk. But I found out that these two people do not report to Grodin. They are directly appointed by Count Ranner. Therefore, although this silver mine produces nearly 15 tons of silver every year, our Lord Baron doesn't really get much of it. Grodin is a really useless lord. Brando could not help but sympathize with the pitiful creature. So you're asking me to touch Count Ranner's cheese, Amandina? He smiled faintly. Amandina smiled back. Didn't you already touch it, my lord? Brando turned his head and saw Yuta looking at him. He noticed that even though she still maintained a reserved expression, there was a hint of anxiety in her green eyes. Seeing that Rabin and Cornelius had been appointed, Yuta did not want her people to be betrayed in the end. Even though the young lord seemed amiable, she had dealt with many nobles, both big and small. In her heart, she maintained the necessary disdain and suspicion for these fellows. Even if it was just a little, she knew how despicable these people could be when they turned hostile. Yuta pleaded with a hoarse voice, My lord, please let me take over Shaflund. I know the situation there. There are only 100 soldiers stationed in the mine. She pressed her hand against her chest, My men and I have more than enough to take over this place. But Brando said, But Shaflund is too close to Paulus. I'm afraid that our other knight is eyeing it. Even if we attack it, we will not be able to control it in a short amount of time. Amandina was speechless. Can't we think of a way? Even the subterranean dwellers can't use it. Amandina asked, Or do you not trust them? It's not that I don't trust them. Brando thought. He had sworn an oath to Tajiv, and the subterranean dwellers would not dare to go against it. But the purpose of taking over Shaflund was to open up the mine. If Paulus harassed them from time to time, no one would be able to stand it. How big is the shortage of food? He asked. We are short of 17,000 bushels. Amandina replied. Most of the units in the Amber Sword used the English system, and this world also used it. This made Brando feel extremely uncomfortable. But in terms of grain, a bushel was about 27 kilograms. He roughly calculated and found that the shortage was close to 500,000 kilograms. This was not a small number. Including our men, how long can the territory last with the amount of food in ABs? Amandina frowned slightly. My lord, if we calculate based on the data, it can last for 2 months. But considering that there are still some food in the territory that has not been counted, it will take no more than 3 months. So there is a shortage of close to 2 months. Amandina nodded. Brando thought for a moment, that's fine. First, recruit soldiers from the citizens as usual. Also, if Bosley wants land, people, and money, give them to him. The same goes for Yuta and Rabin. But the Magicite workshop will have to be delayed. Amandina nodded again. She was just bringing it up. After all, Tonajol did not produce amber ores. The Romans' plan will also have to be delayed. Brando said again. The Roman's voice came from the back of the hall. Of course, Brando. There is no point in doing that now. Amandina did not sound dispirited. Also, we have to at least ensure that the next battle can be fought. As for the budget, you can decide for yourself. Of course, you know that the only requirement is that we don't get chased into the dark forest in the end. The girls present couldn't help but smile when they heard his words. Amandina rubbed her forehead. In truth, she really wanted to be chased into the dark forest. Of course, it was only a thought. My lord, do you have any ideas? Amandina raised her head. She was keenly aware of Brando's intentions. Of course, it's still the silver mine. Brando smiled. With such a large piece of cheese in front of us, there is no reason for us not to touch it, is there? But Medici seemed to have thought of something. Are you saying that we should change the method, my lord? The silver fairy princess raised her head. Her silver eyes flashed with a hint of understanding, and her eyebrows raised slightly. Brando looked at her with praise. Yes, you and Scarlet will make a trip with me. We will meet with Count Randner's subordinates. He turned to Jutta and said, Miss Jutta, you should come as well. Jutta was startled, but she immediately reacted. Do we need to bring people? Of course, but we don't need too many. Brando thought for a moment. 20 to 30 people should be enough. Amandina nodded silently, but then she felt a little strange. Brendel was clearly much younger than her, but his words made her feel as if she was a head shorter than him. It was not just because of their status, but also because he had a special aura that allowed him to maintain a natural advantage in front of anyone. She was a little uncertain, but she subconsciously thought that this young man would be the same even if he met the king. Even though this thought was a little ridiculous, Jutta subconsciously told herself that it was right. But that was not important. Brando's appointment allowed her to breathe a sigh of relief. She immediately took action. She bid farewell to Brando and went to gather her men. Amandina watched as the woman left. Do I have to go with you? Amandina turned her head and asked. She was obviously a little unwilling. After all, it was not easy for her to settle down, and she was not a person who liked to run around. You can stay. Brando saw her reluctance and replied, help me organize a plan while you're at it. What plan? The plan to rebuild Abes. Ah. Amandina's eyes widened. Brando knew that she would be surprised, but this was one of his original plans. In his plan, he would not allow the tragedy of history to repeat itself. But if Princess Griffine did not marry Duke Aurek, then the royal faction's army would face defeat in the rewritten history. At that time, the northern dukes and the prince's army would be swept away. Brando hoped that at that time, the newly built city of Abes would be able to become the final fortress that could stop this terrifying army. It would protect Erwin's remaining territory south of Abes territory, especially Valhalla, which was his hope of turning the situation around in the future. Other than this reason, Abes' location was also very good. It was close to the sea to the west, and connected to the Schaflund silver mine to the east. In the future, it would also become the center of Tonajol and Valhalla. The importance of the location was self-evident. But because of the existence of Valhalla, Abes was not the ideal location for the capital. In Brando's plan, Erwin's future capital would definitely be Valhalla. But this place was more than enough to be the last solid barrier for Valhalla to connect to the outside world. In Brando's mind, Abes had to be built into a fortress, but it was not possible here. He had to choose another location. He had already ordered Tajiv and the subterranean dwellers to head north to find a suitable location to build a fortress. The ideal location not only had to be large enough to accommodate the future fortress, but it also had to be easy to defend and difficult to attack. North of the Gus River was a large area of hills, and Brando thought that it would not be a problem for the subterranean dwellers to find a suitable location. These subterranean dwellers were not good at sieges, but that did not stop them from becoming the best builders in Jorgandi Ridge. He looked at Amandina's puzzled eyes and replied, "Don't be so surprised. This matter will not be done overnight. We have 1 to 2 years, and this is just a long-term plan." Building a fortress in 1 or 2 years sounded inconceivable in the real world. But it was not impossible in Wonde. With the help of magic, some things were easier than expected. Of course, building a complete city in 1 or 2 years was difficult, but it was more than enough if it was just a prototype. What do I need to do? Amandina took a deep breath when she heard the news. Building a fortress was not a small matter. There were too many things involved, and this was the first time she doubted whether she could do it well. It's fine. You can observe ABs for a while, and think back to everything you saw in Bragg's. Look at how our predecessors did it, and then think about what we need. Brando emphasized that the new ABs would be a fortress, and he continued, also, the Shire should be able to help you. Even though he's a wizard, most wizards come from books, and simple engineering knowledge should not be a problem for him. P.S. Happy Dragon Boat Festival, equals equals grade 12 students will definitely win the college entrance examination. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.